Hello, this is DrPaulCottrell, and I'm recording this on January 17th. We're going to go over the news, especially pertaining to Iran. But before we do that, please make sure you subscribe to all my channels. I have Brighteon, Bitchute, and Rumble. All the links are in the description. You can also find me on Patreon, on Substack, TikTok, Buy Me a Coffee. I have this new feature on my website on the-studio-reykjavik.com called Paper. It's under broadcast. So under broadcast, you can see the live streams, listen to the archived podcast, audio version, and this new feature called Paper, which generates news that you can read about, what's happening around the world and in the United States. So please help support the work that I do by subscribing. All right. And get the great products that I have on my store. These products are e-books. I also have course material on immunology and pulmonology that you can sign up for. You get a lot of information in that course material. Lots of PDFs, lots of videos, learn a lot. You can log in as many times as you want, and it only costs you $25 for each module. So you can learn about pulmonology and you can learn about immunology. In addition, I have great supplements on my store, and if you follow what I take every day, you'll slow down the aging process. So with that, please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get some of the great supplements that I offer, such as the structural nanosilver toothpaste. This toothpaste has structural nanosilver, and it will help to neutralize, improve the health of your oral cavity, reduce plaque, and when you improve your oral cavity, you're reducing cardiovascular disease and valvular disease. It's a very high quality toothpaste, so please go to my store and use this toothpaste. This has no fluoride in it. It's a very high quality toothpaste. Get a few tubes for your household and improve your oral cavity and reduce plaque formation and reduce valvular issues. In addition, I also have structural nanosilver gel. Now, this gel, you can put it on your hands, lightly coat your mouth, lightly coat your nostrils, lightly coat your ears, lightly coat your eyes. It stays active for 5.5 hours. So if you're around someone that's not feeling well, or you're not feeling well, and you're worried about catching something, and you want to neutralize, this is really important to take. Now, please go to my store and get the structural nanosilver gel. It's called Renew. It's the same as I was selling before. It's just a new labeling. Now, with Renew, it will also help to improve the health of your skin. You can just put it on your skin topically every day, and it'll help to improve the skin. In addition, if you have a cut, an abrasion, or a minor burn, using Renew silver gel will speed up the process to heal. So this helps to heal the skin. This helps to improve the health of the skin, and also helps to neutralize, especially during the winter season. So please go to my store and get the silver gel Renew. Make sure you use discount 5, all caps discount 5, and you get $5 off any order. With that, let's go to Live Now about Trump delays military action in Iran after 800 hangings halted.
Socially yesterday, I do want to put that up on your screen right now, as he thanked Iran's leaders for not executing hundreds of detained protesters. Executions, as well as the killing of peaceful protesters, are two of the red lines laid down by President Trump for possible action against Iran. Now, there have been no signs of protests for days in Tehran, where shopping and street life have returned to somewhat normal, though a week-old internet blackout continues. Authorities have not reported any unrest elsewhere in the country, and President Trump did not verify who he spoke to in Iran to confirm the state of any planned executions. This all comes days after President Trump pledged help is on its way for the protesters. Both the demonstrations and the prospect of imminent U.S. retaliation appear to have receded. One diplomat told the Associated Press that top officials from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar had raised concerns with President Trump that a U.S. military intervention would shake the global economy and destabilize the region. Obviously, a lot to discuss here as the Trump administration and the world continues to watch Iran. So we want to bring in John Hanna. He is the GINSA senior advisor. He's also the former national security advisor to VP Dick Cheney, and we are bringing him in right now. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. Well, I want to start with this. President Trump has been very clear that executions and the killing of peaceful protesters are those red lines that we have just discussed there. Let's recap for our viewers. Why have we seen Iran backing off on these executions the past few days, and why have we seen a decrease in these protests?
Well, in answer to your second question, why the protests have decreased, I don't think it really has anything to do with threats from the president. It has to do with the fact that since last Thursday, January 8th, thousands of Iranian protesters have been slaughtered in the streets. The bloodshed has probably been the worst that we've seen since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Just really horrifying scenes, piling up of body bags. I think people are just, the fear factor has been reintroduced in just how bloodthirsty this regime is. As for the execution, I do think the Iranians probably tactically, very savvily said, why introduce why call Trump's bluff here and risk American intervention? Let's play our cards carefully. Let's give him an off-ramp. He looks like he wants to take an off-ramp after all of those early threats. So let's give it to him.
Yeah, I do want to stay on that topic. I want to put this up on our screen here because, in the last 24 hours, as I said before I brought you in, we've seen a prayer leader in Iran call for the death penalty for protesters and even threaten President Trump. But we also saw pro-regime demonstrators in Iran chanting "Death to America," holding signs calling for the assassination of President Trump via images from Iranian state television. That happened on Thursday. And we did see this circulating on social media.
So we hear "Death to America" from some of these Islamic terrorists and the theocratic regime from Iran. But where's the outcry by the woke individuals in the United States about the atrocities that the theocratic regime is perpetrating on the secular population in Iran? You had a huge outcry about Israelis harming Gazans, but where's the outcry of a theocratic regime killing large swaths of society that's secular in Iran? I haven't seen any protests in New York about it. I haven't heard anything about the protests going on where the individuals that are ultra-liberal protesting against the theocratic regime. No. They're silent. Why? Oh, wait a minute here. Maybe they have aligned themselves to the theocratic regimes. Maybe they've aligned themselves with just Islamic terrorism.
The president publicly thanking Iran's leaders for not carrying out those executions, as I just shared here as well. So how do you interpret these reactions on both sides? What do they tell us about what may come next here?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, the Ayatollahs have to be careful, and how much they're willing to kind of taunt President Trump. We've seen in the past, we saw it in Venezuela when Mr. Maduro decided he was going to call President Trump's bluff and kind of taunt him and try to humiliate him that he got his answers and he's sitting in a jail cell right now. So I do think the Iranians need to be careful here. It looks like the president, after almost 2 weeks of constant threats, telling the Iranian people that if they start being killed, America will come to the rescue. We are locked and loaded. Help is on the way. Take over the institutions of your government. Freedom is at hand. That none of those threats have been fulfilled. We now have that red line crossed, thousands dead in the streets, and the president appears to be, grabbing onto this delay in executions. It looks like as a way to climb down from those threats. I think he's been told that it's very unlikely that military strikes of a limited duration will be enough to bring down the regime. So
I think what Trump's doing is buying time to move the strike group, the Lincoln Carrier strike group, and the Ford strike group into the region to have a sustained hit on Iran and to make sure that there's enough firepower just in case it spills over to other Arab nations. That's what Trump's doing. I think Trump's going to hit Iran. Now, how I'm playing this in terms of the market is this hedge strategy in natural gas and in oil. I'm a little heavy on the natural gas side for the long position, but what I have set up is a what is called a straddle position for natural gas and a straddle position for oil. Because I think what's going to happen is that once we start hitting, oil price will go up. It starts to get stabilized. We've stabilized that region with our military hits, and then oil will come back down.
I think he's having some second thoughts, in addition to the fact that he found out he just didn't have enough forces in the region, that so much had been diverted into the Caribbean that we didn't have a carrier strike group. He doesn't have the assets he needs to conduct a serious military campaign against Iran and take care of our own forces in case there's a retaliation. And so now they're surging some forces to the region. But in the meantime, a lot of people have been killed, and that red line has been crossed. And the president's now in a position where if he doesn't act, I think a lot of Iranian blood, unfortunately, people who took him seriously, took him at his word that America would come to their rescue, who went to the streets because of President Trump's threats to intervene. Those people are now dead, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, based on your experience in the White House, what the strategy was there, why President Trump may be stepping back as the situation is appearing to de-escalate. But going off of that, with protests, apparently subsiding in Tehran, has the Iranian regime regained control, or is this simply just calm before the storm, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it's more of the latter. It's another pause. This has been a long-running battle between the Iranian regime and an Iranian populace that increasingly doesn't believe in the Islamic Republic, is just being crushed by economic failure and mismanagement, lack of water, lack of electricity, being isolated on the world stage by this regime, having all their resources expended to fight battles against Israel in Palestine, out of Syria, out of Lebanon with Lebanese Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen. This has been a 2-decade slide toward massive conflict between the Iranian people and the regime, and with lots of protests arising over the last several years, and an increasing crescendo of violence to put down those protests. So while this may be a pause of a month, 3 months, 6 months, who knows, you're almost going to, at some point, again, there will be a trigger and you'll see the Iranian people back in the streets, because I think this regime has lost legitimacy or any hope for reform amongst the vast majority of its own population.
Yeah, and as we're taking a look at just some of those protests from a bit earlier on in the week, as we look forward here, a protest now off the streets, military retaliation seemingly off the table for now. What realistic options does the U.S. really have here to influence Iran's behavior going forward?
It's a good question. I mean, as I said, I think, over the course of the last couple of weeks, with all of these threats that the president issued, he really put American credibility on the line more broadly beyond even the Iranian question. There are a lot of adversaries looking at what he did after the amazing operation in Venezuela, I think, and after the 12-day war last June, when the American B-2s did such an amazing job. I think American military credibility was at its height. And I think the president, feeding off of that, sort of got a little bit ahead of his skis in terms of what he would actually be able to promise and deliver on. But I think that has ramifications, not only in Iran, if the Iranian people believe that they've been betrayed by the United States and the American president, but obviously adversaries in Russia and China, North Korea, elsewhere, thinking about what they can get away with against the United States. So I do think, that the president hasn't released all military options, that he wants to get forces in the region, and he still may act on it. He's done it before. He's threatened, he's backed off, and then he's decided to go. He did that in Iran last June. So let's see. I think there's still an act or two in this play to be rolled out here. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, and that's my final question for you. What should Americans be watching for in the coming days, or maybe even weeks, within the next 30 days, let's say? Really, how quickly could we see something escalate? What should we be watching out for?
Well, we've got two players here. We've got the United States and we've got the Iranian regime. For now, the protests have obviously receded. The executions don't appear to be going forward for the moment. So if the president wants to take an off-ramp, he can do it. As your introduction suggested, there are a lot of countries in the Middle East, good friends of the United States. We're definitely afraid of a larger military conflict in the region that could disrupt oil markets and their economies, and obviously even their political stability. So if the Iranians, if the situation stays quiet, I think the president's got a chance to have an off-ramp. But again, as I said, American credibility is now very much in play here, and the president's got to decide, does he need to do something to at least show that he was ready to make good on all those promises he made over the last 2 weeks, if not to rescue the Iranian people from slaughter, at least to impose some kind of massive punishment on this regime in preparation for the next round that almost inevitably will come of these protests.
All right, well, we'll be watching any developments, of course, on all.
And this is part of the reason why when we hit the nuclear facilities with the B-2s, I said we should be taking out the Ayatollah. Trump chickened out, kicked the can down the road, and now we are in a situation where we have to go back and fix the problem. If he doesn't knock out the Ayatollah in this theocratic regime, it's only going to make things worse down the road. Now, we already have multiple fronts. When we hit the nuclear facilities in Iran, we didn't have military operations going on in Venezuela. And now we have to move strike groups out of Asia, which are really important to protect Taiwan, to be able to deal with this fiasco in Iran. Again, if you have killed the Ayatollah last year, or let the Israelis kill them, we wouldn't have this problem. Once again, Dr. Paul Cottrell's right. All right, let's listen into Fox News about this subject.
Maybe you've seen the headline. What if I told you that by becoming a founding donor to the DNC Action Fund, you could help solve one of the Democratic Party's most pressing challenges?
Did Arab and Israeli officials convince you to not strike Iran?
Nobody convinced me. I convinced myself.
Someone talked about it.
Over 800 hangings. They didn't hang anyone. They canceled the hangings. That had a big impact.
President Trump holding off on strikes against Iran after the regime canceled its scheduled executions. But the threat of U.S. action appears to still be on the table as U.S. military sources tell Fox that American military assets, including the aircraft carrier strike group Abraham Lincoln, is heading to the Middle East. Joining us now to react, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy Senior Iran Program Director, Ben Talalugu. Ben, how are you doing this morning?
Great to see you, Lucas. Good morning.
What can President Trump do to help the protesters in Iran?
Well, there's a lot he can do. He can continue to support the Iranian people from the bully pulpit as he has. He can continue to bring more military assets into the region to credibly threaten this regime, to make sure that the regime, A, listens to the protesters' demands, B, actually backs down from continuing to throttle and shut down the internet, and C, also begin to actually release many of those that the regime has actually arrested. Now, that being said, it doesn't look like this regime, which is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism and has repressed its own people at home and aggressed against America and America's partners abroad, doesn't look like they're going to be doing that. So realistically, President Trump is going to have cyber options, kinetic options, and economic options on the table. And we're all guessing right now, adversaries and allies alike, as to what President Trump's next move is going to be.
Should President Trump order strikes, what should the targets be? Is it the besieged? Is it other IRGC targets? Would strikes help topple the regime?
Well, it depends a great deal on what the larger U.S. goal is, because you wouldn't want strikes to happen at random and not have a concurrent U.S. strategy towards Iran. A few days ago, when President Trump was asked what his overall end game was, he said his end game is to win. That potentially means that President Trump does intervene kinetically. Yes, he can level the playing field between the state and the street. He can go after the telecom and the electronic warfare hardware that the regime is using to throttle the internet. He can go after this regime's state propaganda service, the Islamic Republic of Iran broadcaster, which the U.S. has sanctioned in the past. The U.S. can also credibly threaten strikes against the regime's transnational terrorist apparatus, as well as make sure that the command and control that the regime is using to repress its own people is taken out. But then again, all of this stuff kinetically is going to have to feed into a larger, more holistic Iran policy. And with 3+ weeks of protests now, I'm not sure why, or we don't know yet, but it doesn't look like it, that both Israel and America have not engaged in things on the cyber shot side to shape Iranian decision-making and to get this regime to back down.
Should the Trump administration be helping arm these protesters?
I would say no, that might not necessarily be in the immediate best interest. Though, that being said, this is the most violent, repressed protest movement in the 47-year history of the Islamic Republic. Iranians are not asking for arms. They're not asking for training. They're asking for international support. They're asking for steps.
So these protesters that are pushing back on the theocratic regime, where's the support by the ultra-liberal in the United States? I don't see it. I don't see it. Where is it? They came out of the woodwork to complain about Israel bombing Gaza. They literally demonized Israel right after October 7th. And they had all these protests that were going on campus. Where's the protesting? Where's the outcry of a theocratic regime clamping down on a secular society in Iran? Where's the protests going on helping to support or rallying the support for the secular society in Iran, in the United States? Where's the protesting? Where's the outcry in the United States condemning the Ayatollah? Nowhere. I'm starting to think that the ultra-liberal is an Islamic terrorist. They care more about the Somalis taking American taxpayer money fraudulently than what is going on in Iran? There is a large population in Iran that is educated and secular, that is of Western values, and they're oppressed by a theocratic regime. But all the ultra liberals, they're silent on that. They're more worried about what ICE is doing in Minnesota.
To be able to actually help them level the playing field. And the way that can happen is if they have a credible way to protest peacefully, and actually for those who are continuing to shoot at them, to not be able to have a free hand against both the Iranian people as well as
here's the thing. In the narrative of the ultra lib, the Muslims are oppressed by Western society. So they can't protest against the Ayatollah because he's oppressed by Western society. This is why the ultra-liberal agenda, this is why the ultra-liberal logic is just wrong. Just wrong. Where's the protesting? Where is the outcry of all of the secular individuals in Iran being held down by a theocratic regime? Where's the outcry? None. 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 But immediately, there were protests that just organically just developed in New York right after the shooting of Good by ICE, the Renee Good. Just spontaneously, they started having protests about it. I have seen zero protests in Iran, in New York about Iran, about the theocratic regime. I haven't seen any. Now, maybe there are, but I just haven't seen it. Where's it in the news? I don't see it in the news. Why is the ultra-lib not willing to protest against the Ayatollah? Why? Why is that?
In the region. So I don't think this is about needing to surge in arms. It should be about surging in Starlink, surging in ways to get the Iranians back online, and then being able to credibly threaten those who threaten U.S. national security interests, which again is the security apparatus, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and even the Supreme Leader himself.
Well, Ben, thanks for joining us.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.
Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the structural nanosilver soaps. They're very high quality. You can get it in lemongrass, also in charcoal, tea tree, and in peppermint. Get a few bars for your household. Very high quality structural nanosilver soaps that will help the health of your skin and neutralize. Really important for the winter season and for your overall skin health. So please go to my store and get the structural nanosilver soaps. And because it is the winter season and we're going into the allergy season in the spring, you need to go to my store and get the structural nanosilver drops. You can get it in cherry flavor, in honey and lemon, and also in blueberry. Very high quality. The moment you have a throat irritation, take them right away. Right away. And that will help to mitigate it, create the mucosal secretions that you need to protect that oral pharynx. Super important, especially during the winter season. And also do the same thing when it's the allergy season. So you're mitigating the reaction. In addition, take this if someone around you is not feeling well too. All right, you can take them prophylactically. So please go to my store, get a few bags for your household, very high quality. Structural nanosilver drops. Use discount 5. You get $5 off any order. It's all caps, discount 5. Go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com.
We send them from the continental U.S. Who have strategic capabilities like bombers to go target certain Iranian assets, or at least send a very clear signal that, to reinforce President Trump's threats. But I think with each passing day, as we surge more firepower into the region, Trump's ability to act, instantaneously goes up and up, which is, why I think we're seeing reports that, when President Trump was briefed on strike options earlier this week, we saw a slight change in tone, which is he's going to need a few more days before he can act on these threats if he chooses to do so.
Right, and going off of that, the world watching here to see if and when President Trump will act. So what signs should we be watching for in these coming days that would suggest maybe a de-escalation or an escalation?
So I think for a de-escalation,
HBO Max is available on YouTube. Watch any award-winning TV shows.
Welcome to the pit.
Get more of your favorites on HBO.
So I think for a de-escalation, the most concerning one is if the Trump administration returns to talking about diplomacy with the Iranian regime. We've seen on and off hints of that over the past few days. President Trump saying no, diplomacy is off the table, but some of his advisors saying the opposite. The Iranian regime clearly wants to shift the focus back to diplomacy or potential diplomacy with the United States because they know military options are off the table as long as there's the opportunity to negotiate over the nuclear program, even though the Iranian regime won't give an inch. They just want to divert attention elsewhere. So as long as President Trump is batting away those options, I think that's a sign that the military option is still on the table. I would also say if there's more and more evidence that comes out, hard and concrete evidence of just how brutal the Iranian regime's crackdown is, and if the protests resume and tick back up, the Iranian regime's crackdown is not going to be any different the next time around for the reasons we discussed. So I think those are the sort of the immediate indicators. In addition to the surge of forces in the region, you have to factor all those in together.
Now, I wanted to put this up on the screen for our viewers here because we also reported on this just a few days ago, Iran issuing this
All right, so
assassination.
in the U.S., trading is going to be closed because of Martin Luther King Day on Monday. So I'm recording this on the weekend. So there's no trading on Saturday, no trading on Sunday, no trading on Monday, right? And then stress is going to build up in Iran. I don't think that Trump will be hitting during this weekend or Martin Luther King Day. I don't think the strike groups will be in place yet. So with that, oil is trading, WTI is trading at 59. Now, international markets would be trading Brent. So Brent's trading at 64. There's usually about a $4 premium on Brent versus WTI, usually. Anywhere from $2 to $4. So let's say $4. Okay, so we're looking at right now, relative to Brent, WTI should be trading at about $60. All right, it's trading at 59.34. All right, pretty close. If Brent starts to go up on Monday, then on Tuesday morning, you should see a pop in WTI. Now, trading range recently has been around 56 to about 59. All right. But because of the Iranian issue, oil, WTI, start trading close to 62. All right. So I'm back to my original thesis. When we start hitting Iran, we should see about a $4 pop. All right. Now the question is when we're going to hit. We're probably going to hit a week after both carrier groups are in place. Okay. Now that's probably next week, at the tail end of next week, beginning the week after. So I think that trading range, as the carrier groups are there, traders are going to start bidding up oil in the Brent and WTI market. And it's going to break the $60 resistance level for WTI. So it's going to trade around 61, 62. And then, boom, the hit, and then a $4 pop. So it's probably going to go to about 64, 65, 66. All right, and then come back down. This is the reason why I created a hedge position in the oil market. Now, I suspect that when this happens, that natural gas will pop too at the same time and then come back down. But natural gas is going to be probably more volatile than oil. So, from a energy trading perspective, a hit on Iran by the United States will pop oil, short term, all right, and then it'll come back down. Now, in terms of equities, I suspect that equities, when the strike hits, that VIX will start to spike. VIX is trading at, what's VIX? VIX is at about 1586. I stated that at the end of January, beginning of February, VIX should pop to about 20. So we may be seeing maybe a slightly earlier than expected pop of VIX. All right, in the 20 range. When the strike hits, when that happens, we probably will get a little bit of a sell-off on equities, and that's probably a great time to buy because it's going to mean revert. So that's how you're going to play it. Okay, let's listen into what's going on with Minnesota.
Associated Press are reporting that the DOJ is investigating both Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey for allegedly impeding law enforcement efforts in the state. That investigation reportedly, quote, in its early stages. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey did respond on social media. Want to pop that up on your screen? He said, "This is an obvious attempt to intimidate me for standing up for Minneapolis, local law enforcement, and residents against the chaos and danger that this administration has brought to our city. I will not be intimidated. My focus remains where it's always been."
This is France 24 talking about protesters call for an end to the violence of what's going on in Iran. So let's listen in. This is happening in Paris. Why are we seeing this in New York?
International community to intervene to finally put an end to the violence and the massacre currently taking place in Iran.
It's been 25 years in the making, and now the EU and the Mercosur bloc signed a deal in Paraguay that will create the world's largest free trade area. For a majority
let's go back
of
to
the
live now about Governor Walz.
Testers. A lot to discuss here, so I do want to bring in Sky Lazaro, a state and federal criminal defense attorney. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us to kind of break down more about this active investigation.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And Sky, first off, I did want to ask you, when you look at this a little bit deeper, what federal statute maybe could apply to this and kind of lead to this investigation here?
There's really only one that comes to mind. There's a federal statute that allows prosecution, actually allows for criminal and civil penalties for impeding law enforcement or federal officers who are engaged in their duty as they're charged.
And of course, we don't have a lot of information at this point, but what legal standards do prosecutors have to meet there to bring any of these charges against elected officials?
The minimum burden they're going to have to meet is a probable cause standard before a grand jury, which means they're going to have to present this evidence that they gather. We're still in the investigatory phase, but we don't even know if we're going to get to that point. But they're at least going to have to get to a probable cause standard, which is a low burden, but not nothing, that they did violate this statute. Now,
to be convicted, it's obviously beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a ways down the road. But just to get over the initial hurdle, they're going to have to come up with some evidence.
How often do you see the DOJ investigate an elected official, whether you're talking about local, state, any kind of situation like that? Because again, in this case, we're talking about the mayor of Minneapolis and the governor of Minnesota.
We don't see these very often. When they come up, generally we see them in election type postures or things along those lines. But this is a very infrequently used statute. It's been around for about 100 years or more, but it's not used very often. And we don't see investigations like this very often.
And the investigation, I'm going to keep saying it, in the early stages, we do not have a lot of information. We essentially know that Fox News and the Associated Press are reporting on this right now. What are the potential outcomes of an obstruction investigation when you're talking about political figures? They are public figures who are elected. What are the possible outcomes overall?
If they bring charges and these people are convicted, they do have the potential of doing jail or prison time on these, also fines or probation. This conspiracy statute that we were talking about only goes up to 6 years as a maximum possible penalty. It's not nothing. We actually did see this statute used in the rioters on January 6th. And so it has been used.
I don't even like listening to lawyers. I think most lawyers are idiots. I'm going to go to National Review talking about why the Insurrection Act should be implemented against Minneapolis.
Wants to turn down the temperature. Hey everyone, I'm Rich Larry of National Review, and that was Governor Tim Walz taking a different tone with regard to ICE and the protests against it in his state, clearly reacting to a threat from President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act in Minnesota. What I want to explain in this video is why there is no question the Insurrection Act applies to current conditions in Minneapolis. I'm going to do this three parts. One, we're going to talk a little about the history of the act. Two, I'll look specifically at the language of the act. And three, I'll make some humble suggestions to the progressive leadership in Minneapolis and Minnesota, how they can help avoid this coming about. But the big point here is that Donald Trump would be fully within his rights right now at this moment, based on...
Before we go with his video, please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the lignans and the turmeric and the ashwagandha that I have on my store. You stack them together, and it will help to boost up your immune system, help with bringing down inflammation. That will help additionally with your cardiovascular health and your brain health. Now, turmeric will soak up free radicals and bring down that inflammation. Lignans will soak up free radicals and bring down inflammation. Lignans helps the immune system and also the endocrine system. Again, when you stack them together, you're going to be able to boost up that immune system. Super important. And you're be slowing down the aging process. When you have a good immune system, you're soaking up free radicals and you're bringing down inflammation. You're slowing down the aging process. So please go to my store, get the lignans, the turmeric, and stack it also with the ashwagandha root to get that synergistic effect. Ashwagandha root will help to control cortisol levels and help to control your blood glucose levels.
Conditions in Minneapolis to send the active duty military there. Now, I'd like to give credit to the research material I use in these videos to the extent I can. So I just want to mention I'm going to heavily rely, not entirely, but a lot, on a great article published by the National Defense University Press on the Insurrection Act. Now, as the authors of this article point out, the basic story here for a long time is ever escalating discretion and authority for the president to call out troops to deal with unrest. But at the time of the founding, there's a tension, right? Because founders hate the idea of the army being used for domestic purposes, but they also fear unrest. And a key influence on the creation of the Constitution is under the Articles of Confederation. You get so-called Shays Rebellion in Western Massachusetts, freaks everyone out. They want a government that is strong enough to deal with these kind of threats. So that helps form the Constitution. But then very quickly, Congress goes further. In 1792, it passes a Militia Act delegating authority to call out the militia to the president. Now, this is conditioned. You need an official, a judge or a member of the judiciary to certify that laws are no longer enforceable in a given area if the president's going to call out the troops. There's a time limit. You can only do this for 30 days when Congress is in session. And the president needs to notify the forces of disorder, hey, I'm coming for you, unless you stop. And sure enough, George Washington, he meets all these criteria, but uses this power to deal with the Whiskey Rebellion quite successfully. Then in 1795, Congress passes another Militia Act removing those various checks on the president. And then 1807, Congress goes further and allows the president not just to call on state militias, but to call directly on federal forces. And this 1807 measure has the support of none other than Thomas Jefferson. In the 19th century, you had the Supreme Court taking up various cases, vindicating the president's power in this area. Then you have the Civil War. Lincoln initially relies on the Militia Acts to call up troops to respond to Southern secession. 1861, Congress expands the president's power in this area. 1871, Reconstruction era, Congress expands the president's power in this area and adds a proviso saying that when citizens' rights are being violated, the president can send in troops. Now, you do get later in the 19th century the Posse Comitatus Act meant to limit the use of federal troops for law enforcement purposes. By the way, by this point, you probably noticed there wasn't one insurrection act. There are a lot of overlapping militia acts, so it could be a little confusing in that respect. But what basically happens, again, to simplify, in 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes sends federal troops to deal with the Great Railroad Strike, and that really unleashes the floodgates in terms of using troops to deal with domestic unrest. 1894, you get the Pullman Strike. President Grover Cleveland sends in the troops. The socialist organizer and unionist Eugene Debs objects, says, no, we can't do that. Case goes to the Supreme Court, and Debs gets stuffed. The court said, quote, the strong arm of the federal government may be put forth to brush away all obstructions to the freedom of interstate commerce or to the transportation of the mails. That was at issue in the strike. If the emergency arises, the army of the nation and all its militia are at the service of the nation to compel obedience to its laws. The court acknowledged there are limits to the domestic use of the military, but, quote, insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combinations, or conspiracies, end quote, provide the president essentially unfettered authority, as this article puts it, to respond in preservation of the law. The military ends up being frequently used to put down unrest. Check this out. In 1903, TR sends in forces to deal with labor disputes in Arizona, Colorado, and then a little later, Nevada. 1919, Wilson suppresses race riots in Washington, Omaha, Elaine, Arkansas, Lexington, Kentucky, then also sends in troops to deal with labor unrest in Butte, Montana, Seattle, Gary, Indiana, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Denver. National Guard.
One of the big takeaways here is that it's not just it's not unprecedented that Trump is doing what he's doing. There are many points in time in American history where this was needed, this Insurrection Act. But Trump is always bad. He's the devil incarnate. No, everyone is demonizing Trump. Why doesn't the governor and the mayor control their society? Why are they protecting illegal aliens? That's what's happening here. They're protecting illegal aliens. Oh, they're protecting their citizens. They don't mention that they're illegal aliens. They're here illegally.
Also involved in West Virginia's mine strike wars in 1920 to 1921. In the middle of the 20th century, you have Eisenhower using federal troops to enforce desegregation. You have JFK using federal troops to respond to a race riot in Mississippi. And then repeatedly, federal troops are used in the 60s to respond to big anti-war protests or to respond to riots in our cities. For the last several decades, the practice has been not to call out federal troops unless it's in the most very extreme sort of situation. Last time it happened, George H.W. Bush calls out active duty military to help deal with the LA riot, which was a totally out of control situation. But the Insurrection Act is still on the books. Let's take a look. This is the most relevant provision for our purposes. Quote, the president, by using the militia or the armed forces or both, or by any other means, shall take such measures as he considers necessary to suppress in a state any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy if it, and let's skip down to the second provision here, opposes or obstructs the execution of the laws of the United States or impedes the course of justice under those laws.
Now, those protesters that are impeding ICE are basically setting up for the usage of the Insurrection Act. Right there. Section 253, Part 2. Or whatever, yeah. Yeah.
Let's roll through each of those items. Is this an insurrection in Minneapolis?
Yes.
I think you could argue
yes,
it's
absolutely.
an insurrection, but that's certainly a debatable point. So let's put it aside because you don't need it, as we'll see in just a second here. Is this domestic violence? Of course it's domestic violence. What other kind of violence is it? It's not foreign violence. It's not international violence. This is violence being carried out by our own people here on our own shores. Are these unlawful combinations that ICE is dealing with? Yes, of course they are. Combinations is undefined. Could be thousands of people. Could be a dozen people. Could be 3 people. And is it unlawful? Yes, of course it is. They're obstructing ICE vehicles. They're impeding ICE operations. They're throwing things at ICE. In some cases, they're attacking ICE with snow shovels and fighting with ICE agents. So these are unlawful combinations. Is it a conspiracy? Yeah, I think you could argue it's a conspiracy. This is at least semi-organized activity. But if you want to consider that one debatable too, fine, let's put that off the table. You've already met the standard with the domestic violence and the unlawful combinations. And are these people obstructing the enforcement of our laws? Yes, that's the entire point, to obstruct and oppose the federal enforcement of federal immigration laws in the city of Minneapolis. Are they impeding the course of justice? Well, they're not attacking courts yet or trying to set up their own system of courts yet, but they are impeding the course of justice in the sense that they don't want illegal aliens put into lawful immigration proceedings, or they don't want the final decision of those proceedings to apply to illegal aliens if they have a final order of removal. So all this means that it's there in black and white. Trump has the authority to go to the Insurrection Act in Minneapolis if he wants to do it. Now, should he want to do it? Well, I would argue as a prudential matter, he should try other things first. Can we use more federal law enforcement to protect the federal law enforcement agents that are there now? Worth trying. If that doesn't work, you can go to the National Guard. And if that doesn't work, then you can go to the Insurrection Act. But obviously, going to the Insurrection Act is going to be a very big deal. It's going to cause a lot of controversy, and you want to try other things first. But conditions there are intolerable, and it should be incumbent on the progressive leadership of the state and of the city to be more responsible. If Jacob Fry does not want the president to invoke the Insurrection Act, he shouldn't be saying things like this.
Imagine if that city or that town was suddenly invaded by thousands of federal agents that do not share the values that you hold dear.
Or this.
We cannot be at a place right now in America where we have 2 governmental entities that are literally fighting one another.
To the extent Minnesota
but the local government is not following law. They are harboring illegal aliens. That's the problem. And the mayor is complicit.
Complaining about, say, the 20th Maine Voluntary Infantry Regiment showing up within the city limits of Richmond, Virginia circa 1863, they are not helping their cause in terms of pushing back against the Insurrection Act. Even more fundamentally, they should stop with the BS about legal observers and say people are just watching ICE and holding it accountable and protecting their neighbors. No, they.
Okay, so there was a news announcement that just took place about Trump is going to impose a 10% tariff on European countries to force Denmark to sell Greenland to the United States. Now, keep in mind, some European countries are sending forces to Greenland for, and I forgot the name of the operation, but they're having an operation throughout 2026 into 2027. All right, so they're stationing troops now. Now, the question is what will Trump do? If I was president, I would find out how many troops that they sent, and I'd send 3 times as many to Greenland's bases that we have in Greenland, just to show force. But the thing here is that the Europeans, they're running out of money. They have to ramp up their war effort against Russia. So they're spending higher amounts relative to their GDP. Germany, France, and England have major debt problems. So they don't have a long runway to be able to fight against Trump on this. Now, what will happen with the markets? Okay. It's going to take a little bit of time for it to digest, but this is probably going to be negative for equity market. Now, what will happen is that I think what will happen is that once that 10% tariff for sure is going to be implemented, because he's going to implement it next month. If it gets implemented, then you're going to see a sell-off in the market. That's the time to buy. You want to buy equities then. Just like how April was a major sell-off in equities, and that was a great time to buy. So if you have cash on hand, buy equities when the tariff get implemented, or when the news is being digested by the market and there's a big sell-off. I suspect that big sell-off is going to be happening. That could either happen on Tuesday or throughout the week, next week, during the when trading starts, or it could happen at the beginning of next month when the actual tariffs are implemented. Because there may be individuals that are saying, maybe Trump's just bluffing, and there's no market reaction until he actually does it. And then there'll be a big sell-off in February. So either it's going to happen next week, that sell-off in equities, or it's going to happen when it's actually implemented in February. I don't know which. But when it does happen, buy equities.
To get off the streets and go home, or in the case of Jacob Fry, perhaps say, get the F off the streets. That would make a difference. That would lower the temperature. But that's so far what the likes of Walz and Fry are not willing to do. And that's why at some point, Donald Trump really might invoke the Insurrection Act fully within his legal rights. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.
Yep, I totally agree. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the Boomer Boost. Boomer Boost has 68 nutrients. It is a very comprehensive compound profile shown on the screen. This will help multiple systems. This will help with brain function, cardiovascular health, help with building muscle, increase your energy levels, rev up your metabolism. It'll help to control your blood glucose levels. It'll help to have a steady burn of energy throughout the day. You'll have more vitality. You'll slow down the aging process. Take this every day. This is a month's supply. So please go to my store and get the Boomer Boost. It's the-studio-reykjavik.com. The link is in the description of this video and all my videos. You can also take the Gladiator Barley. You can take it separately or take it with the Boomer Boost for synergistic effects. Now, what Gladiator Barley does is it'll help to build muscle. You do some resistance training. This will also bring down inflammation, soak up free radicals, and detoxify your body. When you do that, you're improving your immune system and your endocrine system. You're slowing down the aging process. And you're going to have more vitality. And when you stack this together and build muscle, you'll have additional improvements in controlling your A1C levels, your blood glucose levels. Really important. So please go to my store and get the Gladiator Barley and make sure that you are doing some resistance training. And lastly, I have deodorants that are dual purpose. You can get it in citrus, and you can also get it in peppermint, lavender, and tea tree. All right? They're made from essential oils from the Himalayas. No aluminum, no baking soda, all natural ingredients. It's dual purpose. You use it as a daily deodorant, but it will also help to detoxify your body. And when you do that daily, you're improving your immune system and your endocrine system. So please go to my store, get the deodorants, very high quality, and detoxify your body. Now, if you use discount 5, you get $5 off any order. So use discount 5, all caps, discount, and then the number 5. You get $5 off. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the Gladiator Barley, the Boomer Boost, and the deodorants. All right, now what we're going to do is, I think we need to step back and go, okay, Trump is probably going to hit Iran, and there's probably going to be an overthrow of the theocratic regime. And what does this mean? We have a little bit of rumblings. Maybe they're going to bring back the grandson of the Shah, right? I personally think they should not do that, and they should stabilize the country's currency, stabilize the markets in Iran, bring down inflation. So the IMF and the World Bank are perfect institutions for this to help stabilize Iran. And then you have the international community through the United Nations to have fair elections and to allow for a democracy to flourish. And to have NGOs come in through the conduits of the UN in conjunction with the World Bank and the IMF, they have balance of powers, the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and an executive branch, or parliament, or whatever you want to, however you want to set it up for the legislative branch. But balance of powers, and have it secular, and have it a constitutional republic. Now, we have the means to do this, all right? Through the UN, through the IMF, and through the World Bank to stabilize this situation. So Trump should kill the Ayatollah, and the international community should come in to stabilize the economy and to set up equal branches of government for a constitutional republic in Iran. That's the right way to do it. Not bringing on some non-experienced grandson of the Shah and prop them up because we think we can control them. No, the Iranians are smart enough, and they would respect the freedoms that they were given. And I think what will happen is that there will be a positive feedback between the secular society of Iran and Western civilization, and there will be longer peace. But if we prop up someone like the Shah's grandson, it's not going to. We're not going to have enough of that camaraderie between nations. Because what if the Shah's family, to stabilize the situation, ends up becoming dictatorial? And then now we are associated with a dictator. No. We need to use the international community to stabilize the economy in Iran and to prop up and to nurse a constitutional republic. And let the secular society of Iran rule its nation. All right, so it's important to see the history. How did we get here? And let's step back. How do we get here? All right, Now, I told you how to make money on what's going to happen in the news. So you're going to make, if you do what I tell you, depending on how much capital you're putting aside, you can make a few $100s, you can make a few $1,000s in a very short amount of time. So maybe you should take that advice and also help support the work that I do by purchasing the great products that I offer and sharing the links. Because I'm actually telling you how to make money through the news and help to improve your health. All right. Let's listen to Dan Snow talking about the history of Iran.
Is back at the centre of global attention. Protests are spreading, and the government response has been a savage crackdown. Folks, even though I'm on the Nile in Egypt, I have been monitoring your comments. You seem to have been enjoying these historical explainer videos, and so we thought we'd post another one. This time, Iran. So triggered by economic collapse. So in the last few months, Iran's currency has plunged, food prices have soared, many families' daily life has become unaffordable. But it began like that. But these protests have quickly turned into something much bigger. They're openly challenging the political system itself. The government's response has been severe. The authorities have turned the internet off. Security forces have attacked protests in the street. We've got reports of mass arrests. We've got reports that the government have killed thousands of protesters, although the exact figures remain hard to confirm. We do know that the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, has publicly supported the crackdown. It seems like for now the state remains in control. But we're going to understand why. But we're going to understand why Iran keeps experiencing these periods of instability and protests, why popular anger runs so deep. We look beyond the headlines. Over the past century, Iran has been shaped by a struggle really over power, over sovereignty. What we're seeing now isn't just about inflation, it's the latest chapter in a much longer story. I'm really pleased to say in this podcast episode, I'm joined by Ali Ansari. He's Professor of Iranian History at the University of St Andrews, and he's going to help me trace how Iran's past can explain the crisis unfolding today. He has just written his book, Modern Iran Since 1797, Reform and Revolution. If you want to read that, you get the full history. But in this episode, we're going to go back all the way 2,500 years because the whole story really matters. But if you do want to skip ahead to the 20th century, the video chapters are below. So we really hope this helps. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's a mighty subject today.
Thank you very much. And I suppose we're going to start with Iran.
Yeah, just start with the whole history of Iran.
One of the interesting things about Iran, I have to say, compared to, say, if we were to look at the history of Britain or the history of France, whatever, is that actually it almost has a dual history or a dual historical inheritance, by which I mean there's a sort of a real historical inheritance, if we can put it that way, a sort of a tradition that's been born from what we would be familiar characters from Greek history and Roman history of people like Cyrus the Great and Darius and Xerxes, you know. But also what the Iranians have inherited is a very, very rich mythological history. And that for me is fascinating because that mythological history in many ways has informed the Iranian mind much more profoundly than the real history. I mean, it's a curious twist in a way. And it reminds us, and I think as me as a historian, it reminds us that these historical narratives are much more complex and mixed than we think.
With Iran, it is a place that has been both bigger and smaller than its current borders. Well, where is the Iranian heartland, both geographically and historically, and when did it begin?
Well, interestingly, traditionally, and the Iranian sort of worldview, they have this concept of the empire of the Iranians. Now, Iran itself is basically a cognate term that comes from, and we might as well deal with this, from the term Aryan. Now, of course, the term Aryan has a lot of very negative connotations today. But traditionally, in the 19th century, people tended to use the term as a linguistic distinction. And what the Iranians were basically part of the Indo-European family of tribes that came from Central Asia and moved from that sort of Central Asian basin into what we now know as the Iranian plateau. And the area which they populated, which they considered to be their, if you will, their territory, their core, lay between the rivers of the Euphrates, the Indus, and then the mountains of the Caucasus, and then in the northeast, the Oxus. Now, this is rather large, you might imagine. You know, I mean, this is basically the empire of the Aryans, or the empire of the Iranians, as they call it, and it's obviously grown and shrunk according to time. But in the traditional historiography, that is their sort of area. That would be the area of the sort of Persianate world. Modern scholars refer to it as the Persianate world. This is where the Persian language is relatively dominant, although, you know, one might say even in India, of course. I mean, what's fascinating about India is that India under the Mughals was basically Persian speaking, government was in Persian, which is why, of course, when the East India Company, you know, went to set up in India, of course, they all learned Persian. I mean, Persian was the dominant. Why? Because it was part of the Persianate world. And this sort of area, which is, I suppose, a sort of maximalist view of what would be the Persianate world, is one that Iranians, in a sort of a literary sense, at least, tend to adhere to, although it has to be said, the Persians themselves, one might say, are basically, if you want to look at Persian as a province, is now in southern Iran, but the current territory of Iran is basically a slightly reduced sort of borderlands of what would be considered the sort of the Iranian heartland.
And the Persian Empire is one of the first significant, very large imperial entities in human history, isn't it?
Well, in the ancient period, there were three essentially Iranian empires or Persian empires. And the reason they're called Persian, by the way, is because the Greeks tended to ascribe to one particular, the dynastic tribe, essentially, the tribe that granted the dynasty or produced the dynasty. So the first Persian Empire, which is founded by Cyrus the Great, who takes Babylon, takes Lydia, takes Egypt, essentially forms this vast, vast conglomerate, stretching essentially from what is now Eastern Afghanistan all the way through to Thrace, you know, up to Greece and then to the north. Is the first, what we might term, universal empire. It far exceeds any of the previous ancient empires in its scope and its reach. And interestingly, the German philosopher Hegel says that all history begins with the Persians. The Persian Empire is where the light of sort of enlightenment, or the light of consciousness begins, but then he says, but then passes away. So obviously after the Persians, it then goes on to the Romans or the Greeks and so on and so forth. In European historiography and European identity, the ancient Persian Empire looms large. You know, one of the interesting things about Persia is it's part of the foundation myth of the West. So the West is defined against the ancient Persian Empire. It's because Darius and Xerxes are not able, effectively, to absorb the Greek states into their imperial domain, that, as Herodotus then says, you get this division, you know, this is a fight between East and West. And that, you know, great universal empire, of course, eventually succumbs to the challenge of Alexander, who, of course, at the time, Iranians did not consider the great. I mean, this is what I always try to point out to people. They just, you know, and in fact, in Zoroastrian texts and in the pre-Islamic religion of Iran, they talk of Alexander as the great destroyer. But in classic Iranian sense, I have to say, over time, they grow to adopt Alexander. So in the mythology, of course, Alexander becomes a Persian prince. So it all becomes it's okay, you know, he sort of take over, but that's because he's a Persian prince. And of course, in a practical sense, in many ways, when Alexander did take over and absorb, he became a Persian king, in actual fact, much to the annoyance of his troops. But he adopted many of them. So that ancient Persian Empire is absolutely central, you know, not only in terms of Iranian identities, certainly as we know today, but far more in a sense to Western identity. For modern Iranians, of course, they tended to, that period of their history was largely lost in the mists of time and replaced by the mythology. And the reason that happened is partly because the second great Iranian dynasty, the Parthians, come in from the east after the brief period of Macedonian rule, and they bring with them a whole host of historical mythologies of their own. But the Parthians last for an enormous 500 years. I mean, think about it, 500 years is 500. And of course, they are the first Iranian dynasty to confront the Romans. So
do so very successfully.
They do. And the great clash, of course, is the Battle of Karhai, where our good old mate Crassus, you know, wanders over to the east to have a bit of fun, to try to emulate Caesar and the others, and gets a rather bloody nose. And it's a devastating defeat. It's interesting that it's not seen so much in Western historiography quite as much as, say, you find, you know, the battles in Germania and others. But it is a pretty devastating defeat. And Augustus, you know, later takes this great effort to bring the standards back and so on and so forth. And it reminds the Romans that the Parthians are a serious military power that need to be respected. But at the end of the day, the Parthians are a very, I don't want to my colleagues will criticize me for using the term, but they're not feudal, but we could describe them as sort of feudal. It's much more tribal monarchy, if I can put it that way, even though it's a powerful monarchy. And ultimately, in the 3rd century AD, they are overthrown by a new dynasty from Persis, from Persia in the south, the Sasanians. And it's with the Sasanians that the mythological history and the real history finally merges. The confluence of the two rivers meet, you see. And then you get this one narrative. And the Sasanians, we enter the sort of the light of the day in that sense. And the Sasanians rule for about 450 years. And for about 450 years, and they too are a major challenge, both to Rome and to the Byzantine Empire.
And then how do Iranians think about this catastrophic event of the Arab conquest of the Sasanian Empire, given that they've inherited both of those sort of simultaneous legacies?
Well, what's fascinating about it is, of course, here is where you get this clash of two distinct narratives. The Muslim narrative has to tell you that this is a great thing. You know, the decadent, indulgent Sasanian Empire finally collapses against these vigorous, Arab nomads imbued by this dynamic religion. Interestingly, really, in the last 100 years, and even I would certainly say in the last 20 years, even in the Islamic Republic, but this, of course, reflects the politics of the day. Let's not forget that. There is a sort of reaction against this, and this view that actually the collapse of the Sasanians, in some ways, while they wouldn't want to call it a tragedy, there is a sort of a lament. And if you look at the Book of Kings itself, of course, the great Persian epic, it ends with the end of the Sasanians. That's the end. Now, if you think about how many Arabs actually invaded Iran, and this vast territory, by the way, in the 7th century AD, we're not talking about more than 50,000. And this is where military history comes in rather useful, because historians can often make vast claims without actually thinking, what does it mean for 50,000 men to go traipsing through a territory the size of Western Europe? What impact can they have? And the truth of the matter is, where they had impact was in particular sort of urban areas where they had military encampments, eastern parts, wherever. But actually, vast tracts of Iran were not touched by it. It now seems apparent that vast tracts of Iran did not convert to Islam for centuries. Yeah, they just maintained their old Zoroastrian religion, Mithraism, all sorts of other things. Gradually, the conversion came in, but even that conversion, people are saying, was somewhat eclectic. And what you see actually is a much more dynamic interchange between the two cultures. It's actually a successful marriage of different cultures, where clearly, Islam and the Arabs who bring it have an enormous amount to contribute, but it's not a conquest in that sense. It's not a conquest in the traditional sense.
When does, and I really should know this, I have no idea, when does the schism with the caliphate effectively take place? When does Persia then break off and re-establish itself as a separate entity? Is it when the seat of the caliphate moves west towards Europe?
Well, what's interesting is a very good colleague of mine always says that the modern Iran begins with the Mongols, which is a bit depressing, I have to say. But he's got a point. And really what happens by the 10th and 11th centuries, you get a huge influx of Turkic tribesmen coming in from Central Asia. They start coming in as military mercenaries, and then once they come in, they start to take over. So they come in, they settle in, and then they start to take over, basically. But what you find with two particular dynasties, one is the Seljuk Turkish dynasty, comes from Central Asia. It basically established itself in an Iranian. It becomes a Persian dynasty. And the ministers, the viziers are all Persian. It takes place in the 11th century. And then, so 200 years later, you get the Mongol onslaught.
Were the Mongols a terminal event for Iranian civilization from which that entire part of the world has never recovered? How did it give birth to modern Iran?
Well, yes. I mean, there is certainly in the Arab histories, they say this is such a catastrophe, and had the Mongols not come and sacked Baghdad, the Arab world would now be ahead of the Europeans. This is, fanciful, to be honest, partly because Baghdad at this stage was really a bit of a provincial town. I mean, the power had shifted elsewhere. Moreover, as a number of historians have pointed out, we cannot, on the one hand, underestimate the damage that the Mongols did to the area. I mean, they slaughtered on an uncomfortably, indulgent scale, I have to say. And the tales, I mean, you read the histories by Persian historians at the time, and they talk about it in the most gruesome ways of, wandering over fields where they realise they're just mulching through dead bodies, and they hadn't occurred to them. And the Mongols obviously didn't like cities. They didn't like urban. They thought they were very decadent and all that. And frankly, the sooner we get rid of them, the better. But once they settled down and adapted, whatever, I mean, what someone was saying is that the damage to the agricultural, sort of the sedentary lifestyle of the country was devastating, but it could recover. For me, the real damage, in a sense, of the Turkic-Mongol invasion is not the immediate consequence. It's the fact that they actually altered the nature of the political economy of the country, by which I mean that from the 13th century onwards, Iran becomes less of a sedentary, urban, sort of agricultural economy. It becomes much more of a nomadic economy. And, these tribal sort of setups in the northern parts of the country become very heavily pastoral. And the sort of the large-scale farming enterprises and irrigation in particular were largely neglected. Not entirely, but largely neglected. What the Mongols did effectively it's not that, that things have been declined for many, many years, but they basically confirmed it. They basically put a seal on it. And the thing with the Mongols really is that the devastation really to the political economy in that sense, or the transformation, I think, is a better way of putting it, is that following on from Mongols, you get Tamerlane. Now, you can take a good beating once, but Tamerlane really does sort of, he, particularly because his form of conquest was just to repeatedly plunder the same area several times over. He never got tired of it. So Timur, or Tamerlane as we know in the West, I think was in many ways really the most destructive element to the political economy. And what it does do is it does change the nature. And I think it's that long-term consequence. So you get much more tribal elements, much more pastoral elements. You get a distinction between the urban and the tribal, which you didn't really have quite so much previously. And obviously the nature of that sort of civilization changes. And even
well, that's the holiday.
Civilization changes. And Ibn Khaldun makes a statement. He says, almost all, he's exaggerating, of course, but there's an element of truth in this. He says, almost all the leading intellectuals of the Muslim world have been non-Arabs, and by which he really means they come from Iran. And he lists them, And he says, but ever since basically Tamerlane or whatever, that's ended. Now of course it's an exaggeration to say that, but there's also an element where that high tide of scientific intellectualism that you do get in Eastern Iran, and you don't get that again really from the 14th, 15th century onwards.
And is that timing a little bit awkward because that coincides with the beginnings of European incursions into the Indian Ocean space?
Actually, European dominance really doesn't come till the late 18th, probably 19th century. And, to look at decline going too far back is a bit excessive. But it's certainly, I think there is certainly also a case to be made for the fact that the beginning of European sort of exploration and discovery and whatever coincides with the time when empires in China and India and also in the Middle East start to basically turn inwards in a way, and are really trying to recover. Now they do obviously recover, and one does, as I said, the main thing one doesn't want to exaggerate is, of course, the Ottoman Empire was extremely powerful, and then in the 16th and 17th century does extend very much. But what is interesting, I suppose, is this: it's not matched by a level of scientific inquiry in the way that we may have had beforehand, and that is interesting. It's one of the great questions that I think of historians of the Middle East is just why that intellectual vibrancy just doesn't seem to pick up again. And certainly in the Iranian case, with the emergence of the Safavid dynasty in the 16th century, the sciences become heavily theological, if I can put it that way. Interestingly enough, Iran, right through to the end of the 17th century, was viewed in the West as, partly because of the sort of biblical inheritance, the Europe didn't approach Iran without an enormous amount of cultural baggage, so they tended to view Iran as extraordinarily powerful, rich, and so on and so forth. But it still had a reputation for being, one, commercially fairly wealthy, but also scientifically fairly advanced. There's a wonderful map that a German cartographer has of Persia in the 17th century. Beautiful map, and it has a cartouche. And as friends of mine say, if you look at Western cartographers and they do maps of Russia, for instance, normally the cartouche has a bunch of sort of rather grim-looking individuals. They're seen as on the fringes of civilization. The Iranian one is rather good. I mean, they look rather dapper. One of them is clearly a carpet salesman of some wealth, and the other one is an astrologer. He has a telescope. He's looking for stars. And this is basically this view that Iranians are good at stargazing. It's a sort of, has a long pedigree, this man. But it's interesting that even in the 17th century, they tended to view Iran as a sort of scientifically and commercially advanced, shall we say, even though in practical terms, actually, that was certainly not.
Some of the best engineers that I ever have seen in my travails in academia and in the workforce, Iranian engineers, very good. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Get the magnesium and zinc. Magnesium and zinc will help to boost up your immune system and also help with brain function. Magnesium is very important for brain function. So please go to my store and get the magnesium and zinc. Also, for the foundation of my core anti-aging protocol, get the multivitamin. This is easy to digest. This has the multivitamins that you need for proper enzymatic activity, so your cells perform properly. And I have 2 different probiotics as part of this foundation that you take with the multivitamin. You can get it in powdered form or in veggie cap form. But they're very high quality, and with a good probiotic, you're improving your gut biome. You're going to be able to absorb your nutrients better. You'll reduce leaky gut syndrome. You'll be able to rev your metabolism, improve your brain function, because with a good gut biome, you're going to be able to sleep better. You're going to get rid of that brain fog. You're going to be able to concentrate better. You're going to be able to consolidate memory because you're going into 3 to 5 cycles of REM sleep. You're going to be able to detoxify your central nervous system. Super important. So with a good probiotic, you're improving your immune system and your metabolism and brain function. So please go to my store, get the veggie cap version of the probiotic or the powdered version, and take it with the multivitamin. That's the foundation. Now, the first pillar on top of that foundation is to take Max 35, Max 14, or Cleanse. Max 35 is 35 parts per million, Max 14 is 14 parts per million, and Cleanse is 30 parts per million. They're all at different price points. But take a teaspoon a day, every day, swish it in your mouth, gargle about 20 seconds or 30 seconds, and swallow. What this will do is neutralize, improve the health of your oral cavity, improve the health of your oral pharynx, maintain a mucosal barrier, and help the health of your epithelial lining. This is going to help to boost up your immune system and neutralize and improve your oral cavity. And when you do that, you're boosting up your immune system and improving your cardiovascular system, because bacterial growth and poor oral hygiene will lead to cardiovascular disease. So you want to have good oral hygiene. So please go to my store and get the Max 35, Max 14, or Cleanse. Take it every day. Now, if you're not feeling well or someone around you is not feeling well, take a tablespoon or 2 a day. Do that until everything's fine, and then go back to your maintenance dose of a teaspoon a day. I've been doing this protocol for over 5 years every day. It will help to slow down the aging process because it's boosting up your immune system, helping your cardiovascular health. Now, if you're not sick, your body is able to remodel and take care of other areas of your body. But if you're chronically sick regularly, every winter season, right, or during the allergy season or whatever, and you're 2 or 3 times annually getting sick, you're going to speed up the aging process. You look at people that are sick all the time, they age faster. They have more inflammation, they have more free radical buildup, and their immune system is suppressed. So what you want to do is boost up that immune system, bring down inflammation, and soak up those free radicals. When you do that, and you're not sick, you will slow down the aging process. Because if you have high inflammation all the time, if you have high loads of free radicals all the time, you're going to methylate your genes faster. You will age faster. You don't want that. So if you follow my advice, you will slow down the aging process.
How does Iran then involve the incursion of its formal empire in a way that the other great empires of the Middle East and Southern Eastern Asia don't?
At the beginning of the 18th century, Iran faces yet another of its periodic catastrophes, and that is an Afghan invasion. The Safavids, I should point out, bring Shiism to Iran. Under the Safavids, Shiism becomes the state religion, effectively, although I wouldn't want to exaggerate the distinctions, but nonetheless, it does make Iran then quite distinct from the Sunni Arab world. But under the Safavids, there were Christians, there were Sunnis, there were Zoroastrians, there were Jews. It was quite a multi-faith type of empire, although Shiism was the dominant faith. The Iranian dynasty, the king at the time is very pious, rather hopeless, makes a complete mess of it. By 1722, the Afghan rebellion sweeps the Safavids away. It's a complete fiasco, to be honest. Isfahan collapses. What's interesting is this sends shockwaves into Europe. Europe has what the hell has happened? This enormous suddenly collapse, this bunch of vagabonds. And the whole thing's a bit of a disaster. What happens is that Iran in the 18th century goes through a period of violent political turmoil with ups and downs on a dramatic scale. The last great Asian conqueror, Nader Shah, comes in. This is the chap who goes to Delhi in 1739 and knocks out the Mughal Empire just at the time when the British and French are arriving in force on the subcontinent. Interestingly enough, of course, in many European histories, this episode is largely sort of washed over, but it's actually quite central. And of course, Nader Shah returns to Iran with something like, in modern terms, $70 billion worth of gems and jewelry and whatever. Standard operating practice in the period, obviously. I think this conquest and this triumph in India is the period when I think he loses the plot. And as a consequence, to cut a long story short, this great possibility, Nader Shah was not a pleasant man by any stretch of the imagination, but he was a man, I think, pregnant with all sorts of promise. He was the first person to begin the process of a sort of military revolution in Iran. He was the first person, for instance, to actually consider building a navy, and in only the way that a despot can do, to encourage people to chop the wood down in the Caspian and take it overland down to the Persian Gulf. Only you can do that on pain of death. And Nader Shah is assassinated by a number of his officials. The empire breaks up. You get another period of turmoil. And to cut a long story short, basically, by the turn of the 19th century, you have a new dynasty in Iran, the Qajars, but it coincides precisely with the moment when you have this great new challenge, and it's a European challenge, which is far more severe, profound, intellectually.
Listen, paying $14.99 a month for a streaming app, and $9.99 a month for a music app, and $12.99 for a fitness app, and
severe, profound, intellectually challenging than the Arabs or the Mongols or anything else. And of course, the Iranians aren't really up to it. They're recovering from 100 years of war and turmoil. And this is the time when the Europeans start to engage with Iran in a serious way during the Napoleonic Wars. And the French come in. Napoleon sends a very nice letter to the Shah and says, we'd like your support to beat up the Russians and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing, of course, the British move in very quickly, to avoid any French alliance. But the point is that what's interesting is they both approach Iran as potentially a great power. They sort of say, we'd like your help. It's only in that period where they go to war with the Russians, the Iranians do in 1804, and they get absolutely hammered. It took a long time, actually, for the Iranians to recognize just how far their political power had been. So in the 19th century, what you get is actually this greater engagement with the European powers, really in the French at a very small level, but then the Russians and the British. So the British in India and the Russians obviously in the north. They always say, the Russians force, Britain politics, i.e. a bit of manipulation just to get your way, and the Americans when they get their money. They say the Americans are where you can get your money from. The British always are a bit conniving. But the interesting thing for me about the Anglo-Iranian relationship is that actually what they're dealing with is not Britain, they're dealing with British India. And it makes a certain sort of familiarity, accessibility, and for me, it begins to explain why there's this love-hate relationship with the British, because in one sense, they understand each other perfectly well. And the British officials who go to Iran in the 19th century, most of them are very fluent in Persian. And in the 19th century, you begin to see Iranian intellectuals certainly absorbing the intellectual achievement of what they see as the West. And for me, what's fascinating about it is that the British in particular are not selling the Iranians this idea that, we have a bigger navy or we have a bigger army, whatever. What they're selling the Iranians is industry. And when you look at Iranian accounts of Britain in the 19th century, that's what they're most impressed about. There was some wonderful account, one Persian ambassador who arrives in 1810 and is taken to London, he goes from Plymouth to London, and they cross this bridge, and he says, this bridge is the most magnificent bridge. He says, it's as big as Damavand. Now, Damavand is the highest peak in Iran, right? It's a volcanic. And James Morier, who's guiding him, says, I think he's talking about Staines Bridge. But they were really impressed by it. For instance, later in the 19th century, when the first Persian Shah came to visit Britain, where did they take him? They take him to see the Fourth Rail Bridge. They say, this is This is what the modern world is.
But why is Persia successful where so many other imperial entities right across East, Southern, and West Asia succumb to formal imperial control by European power?
There were several reasons for it in a way. One is that, you know, of the three sort of Middle Eastern powers, Egypt, let's say Egypt formerly anyway, and the Ottoman Empire and Iran is the least integrated into the Western system. So the Egyptians basically are completely beholden to Western banks and get taken over in 1881. But the Iranians are so, you know, I mean, they're just so disconnected from it in that sense. It's on one level, you know, that sort of route in isn't really a possibility. The other side of it is because there's this sort of competition between the Russians and the British. And the British view is principally to maintain a sort of an Iranian independence as long as the Russians don't get in. So there's a sort of a balance of power. It's a sort of a weapons of the weak, if I can put it that way. And the Iranians play on that very well. The British were quite reluctant to get involved in Iran, even though post-1857, which is the end of the first and hopefully last Anglo-Persian War, British influence in Iran was in the ascendancy because they had a very lenient treaty, the Treaty of Paris. And the Iranians were sort of like over the moon. But even then, when the Iranians were actively in some way seeking to engage with Britain as a sort of the friendly power, the British India in particular was extremely reluctant. Yeah, they just didn't want to get involved because, frankly, they've come to an agreement with the Russians and they don't want to annoy the Russians. Our interests are primarily in Europe, and we need to keep the Russians on side in Europe. I mean, to my mind, it's one of the great tragedies of British foreign policy there, but it also shows the complexities of that policy, that there were so many diverse interests. And the Iranians, of course, could never really comprehend the complexity of that dynamic, that British India and Whitehall had quite different objectives and quite different aims. And I think the Iranians were able in some ways to play off these diverse pressures, but there was also an element where nobody really wanted to get involved either. I should say, of course, at the end of the day, that in terms of British influence in Iran, from a commercial point of view, certainly, and a sort of informal point of view, it, you know, through the British Imperial Bank of Persia that was set up in 1888, I think. Then, of course, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which was formerly incorporated in 1908, they were highly influential in the politics of the country, really through to the 20th century. But, and this is what I will always say, and I always say also to my students, never forget, really, that the British were always, in many ways, on the strategic defensive in that area, vis-a-vis what they perceived to be Russian threats. So the Iranians were able to play off this in some ways, able to maintain a formal independence, if not a real one, I have to say. And certainly the tragedy of the situation is seen in the First World War. If you look in the First World War, as one Iranian historian put very clearly, it said Iran declared its neutrality, but nobody paid any attention to this neutrality, including the Iranians themselves. And that's how bad it was, you know.
TurboTax locations are now open in your neighborhood. So hand off your taxes to an expert today. Now local.
And that's how bad it was.
Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the Clarity Factor. This will help to get rid of that brain fog and allow you to concentrate. By taking this every day, you're going to improve the plasticity of your neurons. Your neurons will connect more. The dendritic connections will improve. And when you do that, you're going to think faster and have better memory. This is a very powerful neurostack. Take it every day. Drink it with filtered water. Myotrol will help with gene expression to build muscle. Do some resistance training. Take Myotrol. This has polyphenols, flavonoids, and lignans to help with the gene expression to build muscle and to help the health of your mitochondria so you have the ATP to maintain and build that muscle. Myotrol is really important to take if you're 40 years of age or older. If you are an athlete, younger or older, you will benefit from taking Myotrol because it'll help you to build the muscle, maintain the muscle, and also to recover quicker after your workout. Olive leaf extract, dual purpose. It's going to help to boost up your immune system and help with your cardiovascular health. It brings down inflammation and allows you to control your lipid profile. Take olive leaf extract every day. Now, I have a lot of supplements that are dual purpose, and that's a great way to get healthy and to stretch your dollars. Because I know that people are having problems in terms of affordability because of inflation. And they're cutting back on, certain discretionary items. But if you pay attention, the key is dual purpose supplements and how you stack them together to get the synergistic approach. Vitamin D3 will help to absorb calcium, do some resistance training, and build denser bone. Vitamin D3 will also help to get cells to go into apoptosis if they're infected. Very important during the winter season. And vitamin D3 will help with gene expression, so your cells are performing properly. Vitamin D3 also helps with cardiovascular health. So please go to my store and get the vitamin D3. Now, a great stack is what I just mentioned. Clarity factor for your neurostat to help with brain function. Myotrol to build muscle. Vitamin D3 to build denser bone and to help with your cardiovascular health. Olive leaf extract, boost up that immune system and boost up that cardiovascular health. So please go to my store, get the olive leaf extract, the vitamin D3, the Myotrol, and the clarity factor. Very powerful stack. And like I said, the magic with supplementation is how you stack them. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Use discount 5, you get $5 off any order. Go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. The link is in the description of this video.
Yeah, but even Iranian, because you know, mixing it with the Germans and occasionally going into the Ottomans and the right, you know, but foreign armies were basically tricked over the country. So by 1918, 1919, any sort of formal government in Iran, in terms of central government, had really come to an end. And that's when you get the next stage, which is the sort of rise of the Pahlavi dynasty that emerges in the 1920s. In 1919, the Iranians sent a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. And in this peace conference, they send it as a delegation as one of the victors in the war, which is all a bit jocular, isn't it? The British and others probably decided that the Iranians were being a little bit over the top by saying they're among the victors. But it's very interesting, their mentality. See, what they argued is they said, well, look, we're here in 1919, and, you know, our great rivals in here are the Ottomans and the Russians. Well, they're gone. You know, the Russians have collapsed and the Ottomans have collapsed, and we're here. Therefore, ergo, we've won. And they issue this thing. They say, we'd like the peace conference to consider giving us, returning to us, all the territories in the Caucasus that we lost to the Russians in 1828, all the territories in Central Asia up to the Oxus. This is the bit that everyone sort of says, blimey, that's the bit there. Plus most of Eastern Anatolia, because the Kurds, after all, are Iranians, and they would like to return back to the motherland. We're not particularly interested in the Shia centers down south, but we'd like it if you consulted us when you do something about it. I mean, that's also quite interesting. What they were principally interested in was a sort of, you know, this sort of empire of Iran, if I can put it that way, back to the old school. Now, most people sort of say this is just a flight of fancy. And it is in an immediate sense, but it also emanates from exactly what I was talking about earlier, that they sort of have this view of this sort of greater Iran that stretches from the Oxus to the Euphrates, this, that, and the other. And here it is, laid out, and there's a map, and it draws the boundaries, and it sort of says that I think this should all come back. Needless to say, of course, this was all refused. But what's interesting about it is that I think it's fed into a lot of the ideas that continue to this day. And if you look at what the Iranians are doing, certainly at the moment, since 9/11, since the removal of the Taliban, since the removal of Saddam Hussein, is they suddenly realize they have an opportunity. It's like saying, you know, I have this idea of Greater Iran, but wow, it's now become a political reality, you know, and I can do something about it. And so now you find them basically making claims really in Mesopotamia, parts of certainly Western Afghanistan. Herat has always been seen as a Persian city. You know, why the hell shouldn't we have a bit more? Now, I don't want to exaggerate the claim of an irredentism, because that would, needless to say, cause all sorts of anxieties. It's not that so much, but it is basically something where the Iranians say this is our near abroad, and you know, this is the Persian world. And of course we have right. In fairness to them, you know, when the Arabs or the West sort of say, you know, Iran should not interfere in these areas, sort of say to them, well, they are sort of, it's part of their hinterland. Why wouldn't they have an influence in these areas? Of course they would. I mean, if the Saudis feel they can have an influence in Afghanistan and also in Central Asia and certainly in Caucasia, you know, where they think they do. So I think that does feed in, and you don't really get the sense of how important that is unless you have an appreciation of the history or how they understand it.
The Iranians turned up.
It's about time I made Marvel Rap with the most hero-packed shooter ever. But first, some hot redheads trying to blast my ass if you know horse.
The Iranians turned up to Versailles, where the world was going to be reordered, well, to the peace process following the First War anyway, with a giant map saying this is what we feel Iran should look like.
they came in with a number of issues that they wanted to address, not only territorially, but also they wanted help with the rebuilding of the country. And what's interesting is the way in which they approached the whole peace conference. They went in with a lot of preparation. And above all, what they wanted was legal recognition of the country, which was quite interesting. I mean, they went in, became members of the League of Nations, and they basically said, look, we want the territorial boundaries of the state to be recognised, which is, at the very least, that they did get. And so in that sense, they scored a few positive points. But on the wider issues, obviously, they were completely turned down on all their vast territorial sort of claims. They wanted, most of Central Asia, parts of the Caucasus back, and all these sort of areas that were stripped by the Russians in the 19th century.
It's an interesting moment, isn't it, for Iran? Because there are very few non-European / North American powers present in that process. So it's a moment on one level of kind of it's an indication of the spectacular reach and power of European imperialism. And yet it's also a moment of great crisis for that imperial system, right? So where does Iran fit into that?
Well, it's trying basically to sort of exploit the new legal framework, the whole thing with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. I mean, it wants to sort of take advantage of what it considers to be a new age in a sense. But at the same time, it comes up against sort of real sort of practical realities. And the practical reality is that the British feel that they are basically in the lead position in Iran. The Ottoman Empire's gone, the Russian Empire's gone. So Curzon, who's then Foreign Secretary, sort of comes out with this sort of wizard idea, and he sort of says that, look, you want all these people to come and help you, which is fine. But we'd rather we did it all ourselves. So the British make an offer to the Iranians, say that we will come in to assist with the reconstruction of your country. And this is viewed, very controversially among Iranian historians, because they sort of see this as an attempt by Curzon to establish a protectorate in Iran. And that's, a simplistic understanding of it. It's not entirely correct. But it's certainly true that Curzon had a much, much stronger ambition and desire to get engaged with Iran than almost any other British politician. Most British politicians just wanted to get out. They weren't interested. Yes, they had the mandates in the rest of the Middle East. They were obviously focused on India. They didn't want to really extend it even further into Iran. So you get this period between 1919 and 1921 where this Anglo-Persian agreement, as it's known, is still born. It doesn't actually go anywhere. It's not ratified. Curzon gets more and more annoyed. He gets irritated with British officials who are dragging their feet as far as he's concerned. And finally, in 1921, Iranian constitutionalists and others basically decide that they've got to take matters into their own hands. They judge the mood of the British to be quite sympathetic to this, because the British, of course, want to leave Iran in a stable but friendly position so they can get out and spend less money. And they find the commander of the Cossack brigade that used to be officered by Russians, but obviously they all left after the Russian Revolution, so it was now officered by Iranians. And a gentleman by the name of Reza Khan comes with an Anglophile journalist by the name of Sayed Zia, and they launch what we now know really is a coup in 1921 to overthrow the then sitting prime minister, not the monarchy or anything, but just the prime minister, and establish a new radically reforming government. And between 1921 and 1925, you see a series of measures brought in to basically restore the central authority in the state. And Reza Khan gradually pushes out all these civil politicians and basically says, I'm going to take control. He's the sort of strong man. He's very much supported by all these intellectuals, by the way, because they say, and it's quite interesting, they say what we really need in Iran, he said, we'd quite like a Napoleon-like figure, but we're not really ready for a Napoleon-like figure because our situation is so bad. We tried this constitutional revolution, but what's the point of having a constitution when you don't have a government? What we need is a government. So they come in and they say, what we need is a Peter the Great type figure. Now, if you think about Peter the Great, he's not the nicest person. So basically they sort of think, people sort of a bit worried about this, is this the right model to be picking, Peter the Great? But anyway, that's the sort of thing they talk about, and they're very explicit about it. And Reza Khan, leader of the Cossack Brigade, basically becomes this Peter the Great type of figure with exactly that sort of type of modernising zeal, including reforming dress and, making people shave and this sort of thing.
Not dissimilar to what's going on in Turkey across the border.
Not dissimilar, actually, not at all. And of course, his soulmate, if you look at it, is Mustafa Kemal, and the radical changes taking place there. Of course, we now know, and previously, historians tended to say that Reza Khan emulated Ataturk as he became known, but actually it was a much more parallel sort of development. Both of them started from different stages. Iran was way behind Turkey, really, in terms of this development, and in some ways, Iranian revolutionaries were, as a consequence of that, even more radical in their attempts to push the country forward. So eventually, in 1925, I mean, there's a few sort of tussles, sort of an abridgment, by the way, but but the few tussles, and eventually it's decided that the old dynasty that had been ruling Iran since 1797, they're all washed out, useless. They spend most of the time in Europe anyway. So Reza Khan is invited, and I use invited in a very sort of like loose term, to become king and to become to found a new dynasty known as the Pahlavi dynasty. He takes a new surname, Pahlavi. He sort of aspires to the pre-Islamic dynasties and the pre-Islamic. And from 1925 to 41, Reza Shah, as he's then known, Reza Shah, as he's then known, with a cohort of ministers, really puts through, I think, one of the most radical transformations and radical projects of state building that certainly we've seen in the Middle East, and certainly in the Iranian case. And many of the things that Reza Shah puts into place, good and bad, are there today. I mean, this is the thing. He's a very controversial figure, the Peter the Great of Iran, so it's not exactly, But at the same time, he's the one that builds up a judiciary, a whole new legal code. Very famously, he establishes the University of Tehran. He dramatically transforms the educational structure of the country. A lot of this is, it's beginnings. You don't see the fulfillment of some of these until the next 20 or 30 years. But nonetheless, he lays the foundations of a lot of sort of transformation of the country, social, economic, and political.
And is it European in its inspiration?
It is European in its inspiration. It's what we would call sort of, in the language of the time, they're sort of aspiring to a modernization, which they sort of acquire from the European. They borrow very heavily from French models of statecraft in terms of the centralization of the state, but they also, in terms of the political system, at least in lip service, borrowing over sort of a constitutional monarchy, as in the British parliamentary system. But in actual fact, really what Reza Shah is nothing. I mean, interestingly enough, he believes himself to be constitutional, but actually he's an autocrat. I mean, he's an autocrat in every sense, and he's pushing things through. And the thing is that he can't do a lot of things he wants to do without this cohort of sort of intellectuals around him. And eventually they all fall out with him because, there's all these things, the autocrat becomes paranoid and they all get fed up with him. But the fact is, when you look at it in the round, there's a huge amount is achieved. But the critical factor that isn't, and this is the thing, is that what he does is he builds the state, he builds, one part of the equation in that sense, but they don't actually get round to finishing off that process of reform by building in sort of the rights of the citizen. You see, so you have this judiciary, which is very impressive. I mean, they turned this judiciary around in rapid time, and the man who sort of actually did all the work eventually sort of dies of exhaustion. But the point is that if you look at legal reforms at the time, it's all about the rights of the state. And, you see judges say, what about the rights of the citizen? Well, they haven't really got round to that yet. And this is a problem, you see, and I think at the end of the day, and when you look at modern Iranian history, it is the fundamental problem that the reform and the sort of revolution that took place in the early part of the century, and you see this actually broadly in the Middle East, to be honest, what they do is they strengthen the state. But they don't actually get round to really looking at the defense of the rights of the citizen. So, Reza Shah goes through, he's basically, his active period is, very active period is obviously from the period of the coup, before he's king, really till about 36, 37, after which, most of his intellectual sort of cheerleaders are either, locked up, some of them die mysteriously in prison, others of them are in exile, so on and so forth. And finally, interestingly, in 1941, he's basically deposed by an Anglo-Soviet invasion of the country. Second World War breaks out, Iran declares neutrality, as is part of the course, and the Nazis invade the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, they're fairly rapid in their sort of like descent into the Soviet Union in 1941. It is then decided that Iran can perform the role of a land bridge to provide supplies to the Soviet Union. So I think in August 1941, the Russians and the British invade from north and south. Reza Shah's army, which was much vaunted, it was quite modern, so on and so forth, basically collapses. Not, it has to be said, because the ordinary soldier was doing such a bad job, but I don't think the officer class did terribly well. But nonetheless, they go in 6 days. Reza Shah is deposed. Churchill comes in. Who the hell are we going to replace him with? It's quite interesting, actually. Churchill actually decides, we don't like these Pahlavi people. They're a bit too modern. They're not actually as pro-British as we'd like, or supportive. So what we'd like is, let's go back and see if we can find an heir from the previous dynasty. And it turns out that the heir to the previous dynasty is actually serving in the Royal Navy and can't speak Persian. So, no chance there. So they then find, obviously, the heir apparent, a young Mohammed Reza Shah, 21. I mean, think about it, 21. In 1941, he's 21. He's got, his father's just been kicked out. The officials bring him and they say, right, take the oath in Parliament, you're the new king. But his first 5 years of his reign are basically during the Allied occupation. The Allied occupation from 1941 to 46 releases all sorts of political tensions in the country. So there's a period of 20 years when politics is completely repressed. Suddenly the Allies come in, and there's a real contest between the Soviets and the Anglo-Americans, because the Americans come in, for the hearts and minds of Iranians. And the key difference here, interestingly, is the Soviets start distributing wireless radios to people. You have to be literate. So they send these peasants and they start pumping out Radio Moscow, telling you that the workers' revolution is at hand. So the Anglo-Americans then decide to counter that by putting out their own propaganda. And the consequence of that, actually, is that the Iranian population becomes a lot more politicized, ironically enough. And it's quite interesting. So the Allies finally leave in 1946. The Soviets, fairly reluctantly, has to be said, they sort of hang around there, trying to seize bits of territory, as is part of the course. Through various diplomatic means, the Iranians, with a bit of help from the Americans, eventually get them out of northern Iran. But it's a febrile atmosphere. I mean, it is a febrile atmosphere. The Iranians are becoming intensely nationalistic. It's become highly politicized. They see that they were able to get the Soviets out of northern Iran with a bit of help from the Americans, but a lot of it was actually to do with some pretty mean diplomacy by Iranian officials. I mean, they were fairly sort of like elastic, as they said. And then the Iranians turn their attention. They say, well, we kicked the Soviets out of the north. Let's turn our attention to the Anglo-Iranian oil company down in the south. Why is this foreign company got this huge concession for our oil resources in the south? And this leads inexorably to the oil nationalization crisis, which is one of the pivotal and seminal moments, obviously, in modern Iranian history, and sadly in the relationship between Britain and Iran.
Is it also a moment in which Britain's weakness beyond Suez becomes apparent?
Well, this is the interesting thing. Obviously, Iranians always like to claim that everything starts with them. So, one of the things is the Cold War. Most people assume the Cold War basically starts not with the Berlin airlift, but with the Azerbaijan crisis, because the Soviets refused to withdraw from Azerbaijan. And there's an element of truth in that. Again, the Iranians will say, well, Suez is a bit of an afterthought. The real crisis comes when this oil nationalization crisis. And I know you've had one of your other speakers here, James Barr, in his excellent book, also talks about this. I think he's quite right in saying that normally it's seen as a wonderful example of Anglo-American cooperation. I mean, not much to Iran's benefit, but actually he's quite right in saying it's exceptional. It is exceptional that what you find is Britain, after the war, obviously one of the victors, wants to reinstate itself, reposition itself, but finds itself fatally weakened by the war. Because much like after the Great War, but worse now, it's financially in a much weaker position. What did the oil resources in Iran mean for Britain? It meant fundamentally that it could source oil in pounds sterling, that it had access, in a sense, to a cheap resource that was absolutely essential for the industrialized world. And the Americans were quite keen in some ways to remove that option from the British. So it's much better, I think, to see this crisis not as a sort of a bilateral struggle between the Anglo-Americans and the Iranians, but a trilateral struggle between the three of them, really for power politics. And that ultimately, Mossad there, the Prime Minister, who I think was a child of the Constitutional Revolution of 1906, was a powerful believer in the sort of rule of law and the Constitution. And I think in any other period would have been really someone that, a lot could have been done with. Actually found himself in this sort of power play between the British and the Americans. He, by all accounts, one could say certainly overplayed his hand. He probably overestimated the ability, the willingness of the Americans to come in and help him. He, by the end of 1953, found himself increasingly isolated domestically. People were finding him quite frustrating, and became subjected to essentially an MI6.
If a donation makes sense for you right now, I'm asking you to pitch in to the Democratic Party's Fight Fund. Let me explain.
Don't donate to the Democratic Party. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and help support the work that I do by donating. You can donate through Stripe, PayPal, or buy me a coffee. I tell you why the Democratic Party is hurting the country. I tell you on how to make money on the international turmoil that is taking place. I also tell you how to slow down the aging process and to get healthy, especially in the context of the post-2020 crisis. So why would you want to donate to the Democratic Party when you can donate to the-studio-reykjavik.com and help support the work that I do? Again, you can donate through Stripe, PayPal, or buy me a coffee.
I6, CIA orchestrated coup. But this coup couldn't have succeeded, and here's the very controversial bit, I don't think it could have succeeded without a hefty amount of support internally. Now, of course, Iranian nationalists like to negate that period. But put very simply, if you're paying money to people to bribe them, someone has to take it. So there was an element there where there's a whole power play and dynamics going on, and ultimately, Mossadegh was overthrown.
And what was the status of your?
Well, what happens is then relations are re-established between Britain and Iran. There's a wonderful phrase. Sir Dennis Wright, who was ambassador, who was later ambassador in Iran, he was sent back to reinstate relations and sort out the oil. And he said Britain and Iran were like estranged lovers. And, now we sort of, it was quite a nice metaphor. But what actually happens is, whereas this is a British monopoly, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, it now becomes a consortium, a new consortium is established, in which Britain has 40% of the stake, but the other 60% is in the hand of American oil companies. So the consortium is actually shared much more. I mean, Britain is obviously a dominant player, but not in absolute terms. It's actually the Americans become dominant, and the nationalisation in that sense is reversed. But what you find is the Americans playing a much more pivotal role. So from 53 onwards, Britain ceases to be a really dominant player in Iran. The Russians aren't really there in the same way. It's the Americans who come in. And the Shah he basically restored, in a sense, obviously always been on the throne, but the whole torrid period, he doesn't know how to handle Mossadegh, he goes into exile, comes back, he claims that people love him. I think really, in actual fact, what he mistakes is a sort of a deep and profound affection for the monarchy. He interprets that as a deep and profound affection for him, which is not quite the same thing, but he says, oh, my people love me and all. So in actual fact, what's quite interesting is the period 1953 to 60, the Shah is trying to consolidate his power, and the Americans become quite bored with him, actually. They don't think he's strong enough. I mean, what the Americans are really keen on, I mean, if you look at the pattern of politics in the Middle East, the French are always going around setting up republics of some one sort or another. The British like to set up constitutional monarchies. I mean, all this is sort of superficial, but you know what I mean? They all try. And the Americans, for one reason or other, are really into strongmen. I mean, what they want are military strongmen. So they're sort of looking for a military leader. The Shah, they sort of think, is pretty weak. And actually, by the end of the 1950s, there is a rumour, a fairly strong rumour, has to be said, that the Americans are actually behind another coup to try and unseat the Shah and bring a sort of a military leader in place. And that failed. And the Americans are very, sheepish about it and whatever. But it shows really in that period that the sort of view we have today that the Shah was America's man and this sort of thing, it wasn't quite so smooth, So really, by the 1960s, there's a strong argument there that the regime is still very unstable. You get the revolution in Iraq, the Iraqi monarchy's overthrown. You get a coup in Turkey in 1960. So 1958, 1960, there's this argument in Iran that unless we take some serious measures, we're going to be very weak and frustrated too. So the Shah is persuaded to lead what he calls a white revolution. Bloodless from the top, land reform, votes for women, so on and so forth. And this white revolution, which is really officially launched in 1963 by referendum, this referendum has sort of 98% or something other people sort of say is all really good. But, it is actually quite transformative, but not in the way the Shah expected. So the land reform basically is meant to sort of disenfranchise a lot of landed aristocracy, redistribute the land to peasants and others. What actually happens is a lot of peasants say, well, because the land is distributed, it's all done on a sort of political basis, on an economic basis. So the land that they get isn't enough for subsistence. So what they do is they resell the land back, and then off they go to the cities. What you find is a burgeoning of the cities. Now, interestingly enough, the first 10 years of the White Revolution, 63 to 73, is massively successful in economic terms, not necessarily in social, but in economic terms. Economic growth is 10% annually, pretty dramatic. Iran is seen as the coming place. Oil money hasn't quite made such a distinct difference yet, but it's building up. And, everyone thinks the Shah's doing a jolly good job. Now, it masks a certain number of problems, social problems that are clearly coming. One, as I said, the migration, rural-urban migration, but also unbalanced economic growth. Some people are becoming extremely wealthy and others. The Shah then has this marvellous, which I'm sure you've seen sort of films of this marvellous sort of like celebration, 2,500 years of Persian monarchy and Persepolis. It's all great stuff. It's interesting. My grandfather loved it. My father hated it. So it was that sort of thing. They sort of thought it was a lot of money was being spent on this. The Iranians were invited.
I'm very struck by the tolerance of these societies like Iran to absorb European/Western ideas of political, social, economic reform, whilst having very clear examples of fantastically malign interference by Western powers. And is that a sort of...
Absolutely a friction between the two. And what you find actually is a lot of Iranian thinkers will tend to aspire to and adapt and adopt Western ideas. Now, Western ideas can be Western liberal ideas or they can be Western Marxist ideas. I mean, the whole range, the whole gamut. What they have less track for really is Western policy. Western policy and politics and the pragmatism of politics often contradicts the high ideals. But that's a sort of a standard narrative of US or British politics around the world in some ways. But there is this sort of essence that, there's a lot of synergy, there's a lot of appeal, and there was quite an interesting case of an Iranian left-wing thinker.
What if I told you this dish was actually healthy? Let's be real. Factor's menu is way healthier than the competition. Their chefs actually know what they're doing. Every meal is balanced and...
Iranian left-wing thinker. And basically, if you think about it, his encounter with Britain is either the oil company or the embassy. It's a very limited, right? He then travels, he's given a visa, and he goes off to Manchester for some reason, but Manchester in the 1940s. And he visits, working men's clubs. And he comes away, and actually the report he writes from his visit is very striking. He sort of said, I never realised, in a sense that actually ordinary people in this country are actually arguing for the same things we're arguing for, I mean, he's suddenly gelled with it. And so you see that at all sorts of different levels. And I think it goes back to this 19th century absorption of these ideas. They saw these ideas as much more attractive. They really were taken by, for want of a better word, the Whig narrative of history. I mean, it was about progress, they weren't really taken in by the Soviet model. The Soviet model didn't give them that, but the Anglo-American model did. But they were constantly frustrated by the fact that they think that, why don't you live up to the ideals? Why don't you? And I think that's that failure, that gap in a sense, is something that the Soviets and the Russians were able to explore, which is what happened. What the White Revolution was, in a sense, was an attempt to try and what the Shah had this idea, and it was a flawed idea, obviously, but the idea was, I'm going to push through these ideas of a welfare state, a massive sort of welfare system, a proper economic development. The Americans were very keen, obviously, on economic as opposed to political development, interesting that partly because of their own inheritance, but they pushed this sort of stuff through, and he said, but we're going to marry it to a very keen sense of political ideas that are Persian. And of course, his idea of that was monarchy. You see what I mean? He said, monarchy is the way, we don't want all this democracy stuff. Now, because of the economic growth, he sort of fed this idea and he started to believe it. Of course, many people weren't really that keen on it, because they said, well, what happened to constitutional monarchy? What happened to this 1906? Now, in 1973, you get a very pivotal moment. For me, the apogee of the Shah's power, 73. And why? Because that's when he's absolutely crucial in the exponential increase in the price of oil. So there's the Yom Kippur War, the Arab boycott of the West, the oil price goes up from something like, I think, $1 a barrel to about $3, something like 14. Major shock, Western sort of reeling and pain with it. Shah doesn't get involved in that, interestingly. He says, oil should not be used as a weapon. So it's very sort of highlight. By December, he gives a very famous press conference in the palace. And he says, right, I've decided it's dishonest and not fair that a price of a barrel of oil should be cheaper than a price of a barrel of Perrier water. So he says, so I'm going to increase the price. And he increases the price overnight from $3 selling the barrel to $11. This makes a bit of a mess. What it does, of course, for Iran, and this is the interesting thing, and I've talked to people about this, people who are actually in the plan and budget organisation, the amount of investment, oil investment going into the Iranian economy in the fourth development plan was $7 billion. So they had $7 billion of oil revenue to inject into the economy to increase infrastructure and so on. They had planned in the fifth development plan, to start in 1974, to inject $21 billion. So threefold increase. The Shah, with his price rise, said, scrap that plan, $70 billion. Now think about it. 10 times the amount of extra capital liquidity. What happens when the economy can't absorb it? Inflation, corruption. And that's basically the story of the 1970s. So Iran becomes the place to be. It's just, you go back, if you look on YouTube, you find some fantastic adverts from the period, all these airlines flying to Iran, and Iran is basically the sort of destination of choice. But there are serious problems, and the problem is the economy begins to overheat, and the Shah doesn't democratize. So what he does is he takes all this and he says, I'm just the most successful king ever. I am the new Cyrus the Great, and I'm doing very well. I've given more welfare, I've given more material benefits to my people than anyone else, which, to be honest, in some ways was probably true, actually. But the fact is, if you're going to educate your public, and there were hundreds and thousands of young Iranians going through university in Iran, abroad, many of them on scholarships, full scholarships. I mean, halcyon days, full scholarships. Of course, what they want are jobs. And what they want is to get involved in politics. They want to share in the political process. And the Shah said, no, you don't get involved. So I think these created really, really critical tensions, which effectively unraveled in 1978. In 1978, a whole coalition of sort of opposition to the Shah builds up a head of steam. Revolutions are never predictable. It could have happened earlier, it could have happened later, it may never have happened at all. But what happens is coalition of left, the religious sort of right in a sense, plus sort of secular nationalists. The secular nationalists from 1906 are now, frankly, just a fraction of their old self. They're not really numerous, but they're seen as sort of the intellectual powers. On the one side, Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, who'd been sent into exile during the period of the White Revolution, comes back as leader of the sort of religious sort of right, if you put it that way, but basically as the symbolic leader of the entire revolution. Then there's a whole left, massive amounts of people on what we might call the Islamic left or the secular left as well. They all push really to force the Shah at once to sort of reform, but really for the overthrow of the monarchy. I mean, that's basically what happened. And ultimately, the reason why, in an interesting way, the Shah falls is because he is so shocked. I mean, honestly, so shocked by the fact that the people don't love him that he basically fails to act. He stalls. I mean, the whole machinery of government stalls. And in 1978, and as one person put very rightly, he said, there's only one thing worse than being a dictator, and that is to pretend to be a dictator. One of the reasons is because he didn't actually like bloodshed. He wasn't keen on it. It's quite interesting when you look at it. If you compare it with Assad today and the Shah then, the Shah, to his eternal credit in some ways, wasn't interested in shooting. He actually said, you cannot build a throne on the blood of your people. And people would say, well, that's very idealistic, Your Majesty, but I think we need to deal with the problem. I mean, the point was, by 1978, really it was too late. There was such a swelling of opposition to it. So that by January, he goes on holiday, which is one of those lovely metaphors for autocrats going off, and off he goes. Well, there is an interesting thing about it, and I mean, one of the things about when you look at the monarchy in that sense, it's absolutely right that there was this sort of sense that being a monarch put certain restrictions on you, that you were bound by certain moral codes. Whereas the Republic, it's much more so. I mean, as you look at the French Revolution itself, in terms of what it was doing at the time, it has much more room for maneuver because the revolution is itself so important, so massive, such an historic event that you can take sort of historic action. It's exactly what you see in the revolution in Iran itself. So the amount of blood, people talk about the casualties in the lead up to the revolution. We now have the figures of the people who were killed in the run up to the revolution. And it comes to, in total, 3,183, I think the figure is. And that is from 1963 to the date the Shah left, and the vast majority, obviously about 2,000 in the year 1978-79, with the vast majority in Tehran. It wasn't really a lot. Now think about that in comparison with the number of casualties that occurred after the Shah left. Sort of unifying figure for the revolution movement goes, and left and right really go. They pile into a sort of civil war, and you get mass executions. I mean, you get a lot of bloodshed. To be fair to the Iranian Revolution, it's not as bloody as the French or the Russian Revolution. The difference is it's on television, though, so everyone sort of watches it. And one of the critical factors in being on television is when they seize the American embassy on November the 4th, 1979, it becomes a global event. And as I say to you, the Islamic Revolution in Iran was the first revolution, in a sense, to be televised. And it obviously magnifies the effect of it. And it was a traumatic event for many, many people. It overturned sort of established order. But in a curious way, it was one of my arguments, it didn't actually remove the state. The pattern.
It got stuck in the branch that it was growing on, and then it also has a line from where it was strung on the.
Remove the state. The Pahlavi state, as built by Reza Shah, is still there. What they did is they replaced all the personnel and sort of developed it in different ways. But if you look at it, you have this new republic based on the French Fifth Republic. But on top of that, you then have this religious structure known as the guardianship of the jurist, which is the supreme leader, but that's what gives the game away, really, isn't it? So it's the supreme leader. So you have a president, prime minister, your judiciary, your parliament, whatever. And then on top of that, they added this layer of the supreme leader. And ultimately, this Islamic supreme leader had ultimate authority over everything. So, when people say it was the turban replaced the crown, in a way it did. But the first 8 years of that revolution were devoted to war. So the war with Iraq took up a huge amount of time. It was a very bloody conflict. They estimate 188 or maybe 200,000 Iranians died. That's in 8 years. But it was the first time the Iranians were involved in what we might call a total war. I mean, the cities were involved. So, and again, it's one of the founding myths of the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Republic. And so that sort of goes, that goes through to 1988. What it does mean is that the political debate never gets settled. Khomeini is in charge, Ayatollah Khomeini is very charismatic. He keeps them together. The war continues. The war ends. A year later, Khomeini dies, not before sending a fatwa against Salman Rushdie, of course, just to keep things on a bit of a tenterhooks. And the real story of the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution from that time onwards is this contest between the Republic on one side and the Islamic elements on the other side. And in my view, the high tide of the Republican element was between 1997 and 2005 when Khatami was president. And since that time, we really, unfortunately, I regret to say, have been slipping and sliding into this far more autocratic, revolutionary Islamic system, which, and I've written in places, has really returned the country, I'm sorry to say, to a sort of autocracy that the 19th century Rajahs would have been more familiar with, because the supreme leader has a sort of absolute authority that is divinely ordained. And whereas previous monarchs may have reigned by divine right, they never claimed to be actually, in a sense, the representative. They might be legitimized by divine authority, but they didn't claim to exercise divine power. That's the difference. And I think what you're seeing in Iran today is, unfortunately, the democratic elements that were fought for in the revolution being quashed under the weight of this revolutionary Islamist narrative. Aided and abetted, I have to say.
Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the omega-3. This will help with your cardiovascular health. They'll bring down inflammation, help to control your lipid profile, and help to reduce the stickiness of your red blood cells. So that will help to reduce clots. Good Night Formula will help you to get into 3 to 5 cycles of REM sleep and deep sleep. That will help you to consolidate memory, detoxify your central nervous system, and be well rested. When you have good sleep, it will slow down the aging process and have better memory function. Digestive enzyme complex helps to reduce the load on your pancreas so you can digest proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. So please go to my store and get the digestive enzyme complex. And zeolite will help to bind to heavy metals, toxins, and chemicals, and help to detoxify your body. Take 3 small drops underneath your tongue, drink filtered water, do that every day, then you're going to improve your immune system and your endocrine system. So a great stack would be to take the zeolite to detoxify your body, the digestive enzyme complex to break up your carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids and reduce your load on your pancreas, omega-3 to help with your cardiovascular health, and Good Night Formula to help with brain function and to be well rested. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com.
Although I want to be very clear on this, I think the West in many ways has mishandled its relationship with Iran. I mean, ça change. But I think, the central cause of this is internal, not external.
So much we could talk about, but let's talk about that.
Hand off your taxes to an expert in your neighborhood. Now, your TurboTax expert can file for you, so you don't have to miss a moment. You've got better things to do than taxes.
So much we could talk about, but let's talk about that sort of the strategic and the standoff with Iran at the moment. When you look at direction, strategic thinking in Iran before and after the revolution of the late 70s, is what strikes you sort of continuity or was there an abrupt change?
Well, all revolutionaries want to claim that there's an abrupt change. They all want to say, and there are elements of change. I mean, obviously, there's a much stronger Islamist ideology. If you look at the regional scope they have now, they're in Syria, they're in elements. In Yemen, they have obviously Lebanon. And a lot of the way in which they try to justify themselves is justified on certain aspects of revolutionary ideology. On the other hand, if you look at, for instance, the Persian claims at the peace conference at Versailles in 1919, and what the Iranians are sort of playing around now in terms of where they consider to be their near abroad and where they consider to be legitimate areas of interest, there's a lot of continuity. They are the granddaddies of the region. They see themselves as having a particular role to play. They always say, we'll be here longer than anyone else, and we'll be here longer than anyone else. And so they sort of feel they have certain rights. So there are strong elements of continuity, by the way. And if you look at, for instance, even in terms of ideology, there's a strong nationalist ideology re-emerging. Also, they tend to mix and match it with religious ideology. But the Shah was severely criticized, for instance, the last Shah for, all this praise for Cyrus the Great. Well, I mean, Cyrus the Great's very popular now in Iran, And, they try and obviously claim that he's got some sort of religious aura about him to make him legitimate. But nonetheless, in Iran today, not only are these ancient figures much more popular, but because of the way in which society's developed, mass communication, social media, so on and so forth, it's got much more social base. I mean, that's what's interesting about it. Every year at the Persian New Year, March 21st, Iranians gather at the tomb of Cyrus the Great to celebrate the New Year. The tomb of Cyrus the Great, some 4 hours out of the year, it's a bit of a drive. They go there and thousands of people gather. You would have never had that 50 years ago. But now, today, because that sort of passion for Iranian identity in that sense and nationalism, good and bad, but nonetheless, that passion for that distinct identity is sort of grounded. It's social rather than political.
What do you want Western policymakers, for want of better words, to understand about Iranian history?
Well, first of all, the West needs a clear strategy, and what I've always argued is it needs a long-term strategy. It doesn't. You can't keep reacting to the Iranians. You need to have an end game in sight. You need to know what you want, and you need to know how to plan it. Carefully how to get there, and you need to understand the way in which history plays a role in everyday Iranians' attitudes. And that doesn't mean, as I'm sorry to say, a number of US presidents have done, is say the Iranians are the heirs to the great culture, and then leave it at that. Or they're a great civilization, and then leave it at that. And you've got to actually say, well, what does that mean? And what I've often said to them, I said, yes, you're right to sort of acknowledge and respect this, but you should also say in some ways, and I think a number of people here have done that, is say that, Iranian culture and civilization has got a very, very strong strand of what we would call humanism in it. Very clear. You look at classical Persian poetry, if you look at books of government, Mirrors for Princes, what they're talking about a lot is the way in which you look after, you treat people, you manage society, you govern for the welfare of all, and so on and so forth. Sadly, many rulers in Iran have ignored all this. There's a famous poem that I think Obama quoted.
This is a point that I'm making. If you use the international community to stabilize the economy through the World Bank and the IMF, and you use the conduits of the United Nations to have free elections and allow for a constitutional republic to emerge, and you get rid of this theocratic regime, Iran is going to flourish. And if the United States helps, then what there'll be is aligned with us instead of China or Russia. So Iran is important in the larger geopolitical play for the United States against Russia and against China.
Sadly, where he says, we are all branches of, all of us are from the Bani Adam. We are all sons of Adam. Now, what I think Obama said is he sort of stopped there. He said, we're all sons of Adam. We're all part of one big Adam. What actually the poem says is very interesting. And it's basically, it's admonishing, kings. He's basically saying we're all sons of Adam. And because we're all sons of Adam, when one part hurts, the other cannot but feel the pain. Therefore, take care in what you do, be sure to treat each side, well. So, my point, it's actually in some ways the perfect poem for humanitarian intervention, actually. It's not a poem saying, oh, we're all, part of one happy family and we all need to live together. It's actually a much, much more pointed comment. Now, Iranians know all this. They know their literature. They're well versed in their culture. They know their history. And if you look at the earlier British diplomats, politicians who operated in Iran, they were well versed in that. They really got in under the skin and they began to understand it. And I think today, one of the problems we have is that we don't have the time anymore to actually really get under the skin and understand that cultural sort of context. We don't have enough linguists, and we don't have enough people who understand the cultural context of that language.
Well, we're lucky to have you. Thank you very much for coming back on the podcast.
Iran's history is vast, and it's complex, and yeah, I think it's important to understand the whole arc of the Iranian history. But I hold a firm belief that if the United States intervenes and destroys theocratic regime and decapitates the Ayatollah, literally, then peace can emerge in Iran. But you have to stabilize the economy, and you have to allow for the secular parts of society to flourish and be a part of the republic. And that has to have a balance of government. It has to have a judicial branch and a legislative branch and an executive branch of equal weight with term limits. But when you do that, then you will probably have a much more stable society. They have a lot of educated people, and they are looking for Western culture to help them along this journey to embrace the republic. Now, there's a battle going on in Iran right now, and that is a society that wants a republic and the theocratic regime and the military apparatus that's tied to the theocratic regime. So the United States needs to destroy the theocratic regime and its military apparatus. And through the UN and the World Bank and the IMF, it can be done where they have a constitutional republic. But rebooting the Shah is a bad idea. Bad idea. That's just falling back into the old thing that can we have a person that is strong enough that we can manipulate, strong enough to control the nation, but that the United States can manipulate. I think we need to get out of that realm. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the C60. You can get an avocado oil, extra virgin olive oil, or an MCT coconut oil. You can get a 2 ounce, a 4 ounce, or an 8 ounce configuration. It is cheaper per ounce to get the higher ounce configuration. This will soak up free radicals approximately 1,000 times more than vitamin C. One molecule of C60 is 1,000 times stronger than one molecule of vitamin C. All right, you take a teaspoon a day, preferably on an empty stomach, and it's going to soak up free radicals. And when you do that, your tissues will perform better, your cells will perform better, your mitochondria will perform better. You'll have more energy, and with that energy, your tissues will perform. Now, this will help to boost up your immune system, your endocrine system, even your brain function. Why? Because by improving the health of the neuron, by reducing inflammation and soaking up those free radicals, the mitochondria in the neuron will be healthier. You'll have more ATP, you'll have more neurotransmitters. And because of the less stress in the cell, in the neuron, you're going to have better dendritic connections, and you're going to have faster cognition, better memory. And by bringing down inflammation in tissues, that means that the tissues won't age as fast. Now, C60 will also soak up free radicals that are in your bloodstream. That helps your cardiovascular health, because by soaking up free radicals at the bloodstream level, you're reducing the concentrations of oxidized LDL. So you're reducing plaque formation. You'll have better blood flow. When you have better blood flow, guess what? You have better blood flow to your brain. When you have better blood flow to your brain, your neurons are healthier. So please, go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, get the C60, take a teaspoon a day every day. If you just start on C60, you'll start feeling the effects of it within 2 months. If you take it for 1 full year, you will visibly look younger. All right? Now, it also helps your basal layer for your skin. It helps to soak up those free radicals, and it's very synergistic with resveratrol. C60 is synergistic with resveratrol to help with the basal layer. So that helps with your skin. So Take it every day. It'll slow down the aging process. Now, I also have a great product. It's new on my store. It's called Super Strong Relief. If you have a bruise, a muscle ache, soreness in a joint, apply this on that soreness and it will relieve that pain very quickly. All right. Now it's temporary relief, but the point here is that if you have muscle aches, a headache, or arthritic pain, a minor burn, this will help to alleviate the pain. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and use the Super Strong Relief. It's a new product. I also have another new product on my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, called Collagen. Now, this is not collagen, but it's collagen. You take 2 large droppers underneath your tongue and drink the filtered water. What this will do is help to remodel your joint and reduce further joint erosion. All right, so this is if you have joint pain. All right, so what collagen does is it helps to remodel a joint by using collagen 2 and also ACAN. So collagen 2 is going to help with the cartilage, and the ACAN will help with the cushioning of the joint. This collagen will also block the effects of MMP3 and MMP13, which are enzymes that cause joint erosion. So this stops that and reduces the inflammation. So you want to reduce the inflammation and reduce the joint erosion, help to rebuild the joint by employing the ACAN and the collagen 2. And this will also help for your joint to use glucosamine to help to remodel the joint, and also chondroitin to help with the cushioning of the joint. So this will help to remodel and reduce the inflammation and reduce the erosion. This is very powerful. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the collagen. You can stack this with the collagen that's also on my store. So with that, use discount 5, all caps, discount, and then the number 5, you get $5 off. Click the link in the description to my website, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Thank you for listening. That's the end of the broadcast for today. It's really important that Trump is moving military equipment, strike groups into the region in the Middle East to potentially, very high potential military operation against Iran. And when that does happen, there's going to be a movement in the energy sector. So, and it's also going to perturb the equity market. If you start to see the equity market start to go down, that's the time to buy. That's the time to buy the equities. So we'll be covering it. So thank you for listening and have a nice day.